Tonight, I'm going to share one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you go camping with the follow button, wait until they're about to go to sleep, and then just go ahead and pour a ton of itching powder into their only sleeping bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. Around 3:30 p.m. on October 25th, 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon drove his work truck along a paved road in the Medicine Bow National Forest, which is this huge nature preserve in southern Wyoming. Carl had taken off early from his job on an oil rig to go elk hunting in this preserve, and now he was heading towards this very specific area in the national forest called McMarty Canyon that he had heard was really good for elk hunting. As Carl drove, he found himself looking around at the evergreen trees and the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and he just felt this total sense of calm come over him. He was a very rugged outdoorsman, and there was really nothing he loved more than spending time out in nature all alone. And so for a little while, he was just enjoying himself, driving along, until eventually the paved road he was on gave way to this long, rocky trail. And Carl, he didn't want to damage the truck he was driving, since it actually belonged to the company he worked for, so he wound up pulling over and getting out, and then he just grabbed all his stuff and continued walking on the trail by foot. The hike along this trail was not only, pretty rocky and rough, but it was also predominantly uphill, and so it didn't take long before Carl was having trouble breathing. And not just because it was physically taxing, but also because when he was younger, he had tuberculosis, which had left his lungs really riddled with scar tissue that did make it harder to breathe, especially when he was exerting himself. But, Carl continued on, and every few minutes he would just stop and bend over and catch his breath. But after about 30 minutes or so, he had hiked to the point where the trees had begun to thin out, and then he found himself standing inside what looked like a big bowl in the earth. So this was McMarty Canyon, where he was, intending to go for this elk hunt. And, the reason it sort of felt like a bowl is because it was mostly just flat with some shrubs and grass, a few trees, and these tall hills out on the sides, sort of giving this impression of a bowl. And so Carl, he sort of just stopped and took stock of the area. And wouldn't you know it, when he looked straight across the canyon, the bowl, he saw a group of just 5 elk grazing in the distance. Like, this was unbelievably lucky. Here they are, right away. And so Carl slowly began walking towards them, doing his best not to make any noise. And then when he was within shooting distance, he just stopped, raised his rifle, and he looked through his sights to aim at the first elk he saw, and then he pulled the trigger. But for some reason, when he pulled the trigger, the gun didn't go off. It didn't fire, or at least it didn't appear to. And certainly there wasn't any kickback. It just was like nothing happened. But then he saw something that just didn't make any logical sense. And at the same time, he's experiencing this just insane phenomenon. He felt this massive wave of vertigo, and then he just sort of felt himself falling, and then he blacked out. The next thing Carl knew, he felt himself being shaken back and forth, and he sort of slowly began to blink his eyes, feeling very confused and disoriented. His head was pounding, it was clearly dark outside, and then he realized, sort of with horror, that somehow he was back inside of his work truck. But the surroundings outside of the truck definitely looked different, like the truck was parked in a different spot than where he left it. He suddenly felt himself getting shaken again, and then he heard someone say his name. And he looked up, and in the darkness, he saw there were 2 men that he didn't recognize who were clearly shaking him, trying to get his attention. And they tried to ask him, what was going on? But Carl's mouth sort of felt numb. And when he tried to speak, it's like the words came out garbled and nonsensical. And so at some point, these 2 men sort of gave up trying to talk to Carl, and they just lifted him up, pulled him out of the truck, and they carried him over to their vehicle. And, Carl heard them say something about a hospital, and then before long, their car was driving off, and then Carl blacked out again. About 30 minutes later, around midnight on October 26th, so this is 8 hours after Carl first blacked out, His wife, Marjorie, rushed into a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, Wyoming. And inside, she saw Carl lying on the bed, hooked up to an IV, and there were a bunch of monitors with a nurse standing beside him. And she saw, her husband's eyes were open, but clearly unfocused. And then as Marjorie is just standing there, taking in the initial shock of what she's seeing, the nurse actually pointed at her, at Marjorie, and then asked Carl if he knew who she, his wife, who she was. But Carl, he turned and he looked at Marjorie, but he just kind of stared blankly and then shook his head and said no. So earlier that evening, Marjorie had been at home, waiting for Carl to come back from his hunting trip. But when he hadn't shown up on time, she ultimately had called the sheriff's department and asked them to go to McMarty Canyon just to check on him. And so 2 deputies had gone out there and they found him, and he was unconscious in his truck. So those 2 deputies were the ones who obviously shook him awake and took him to the hospital. But interestingly, beyond the fact that the deputies had no idea what happened to him, they reported that his truck had been parked 3 miles away from the main road in this muddy bog. And strangely, there were no tire tracks leading to it. It was almost like it was just dropped in the bog with, Carl inside of it. But, despite this weirdness, the deputies, and Marjorie for that matter, were not concerned about, the weirdness around the truck. They were worried about Carl, who's just laying here unconscious. And so they had rushed him to the hospital, and Marjorie had driven there as fast as she could. A doctor had already explained to Marjorie that her husband was, clearly very disoriented and seemed to be suffering from a case of amnesia. He couldn't even remember his own name, let alone, what had happened to him while he was out in that canyon before the deputies showed up and found him passed out in his truck. Doctors had given Carl x-rays and brain scans and run all kinds of tests on him, but not only did they not find any evidence of some sort of head injury, that likely would have caused his amnesia, but they actually didn't find anything wrong with him at all. He seemed perfectly fine beyond him just showing up basically unconscious and disoriented. And so realistically, the staff told Marjorie that because they couldn't really find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. And so for now, Carl was just being kept in the hospital under constant observation. And so Marjorie just took a seat on the couch next to her husband's bed, sort of not even sure what to think of this whole situation. And she was about to ask the nurse a couple of questions, but then suddenly Carl sort of tensed up and began frantically looking around the room, like he really had something in mind that he was looking for. And then he began saying, where are my pills? Marjorie had no idea what pills her husband was talking about, and it was clear the nurse also didn't know what he was talking about. And so Marjorie, she reached out and just tried to grab her husband's hand to try to calm him down. But the moment she did that, Carl sort of stopped what he was doing and he yanked his hand away and stared at her like she was a total stranger. 2 days later, Carl still could not remember what had happened to him when he had gone hunting. But he had recovered some basic memories, like his own name and also who his wife was. And so between that and the fact that realistically Carl did not have any signs of any physical injury, the hospital discharged him and just sent him home with Marjorie and basically told her that he was probably fine and that he probably just needed to be in a familiar place to sort of recover all of his memories and get back to normal. However, when the couple got back home, it very quickly became clear to Marjorie that Carl was not okay and he was not getting better. For the most part, Carl was just unusually quiet at home, like uncharacteristically quiet. And then when he would speak, it often was in that frantic sort of nonsensical way that he had spoken in the hospital when he was, looking for his pills. And in fact, when he was home, he did continue to suddenly start looking for his pills. And then also he began telling Marjorie that, somebody had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to ask him, what do you mean? What do you mean your pills? What do you mean somebody took your elk? What are you talking about? But Carl didn't even seem to know. He would have moments of recognizing that it's so crazy what he's saying, but he just didn't have the memories to be filled in. It was like Carl was just as confused by his own vague memories as his wife was. However, a few days after they got home from the hospital, Carl suddenly told his wife that he'd actually remembered something really specific about what had happened when he was hunting. A new memory had popped up in his mind. He told her that when he was in McMarty Canyon and he saw those elk and he raised his rifle and he pulled the trigger, he said there was no sound, there was no kickback, it was like nothing had happened. But then he said something happened that like truly just didn't make logical sense. He said he realized the gun had fired, but it was like the world had slowed down and he could actually literally see the bullet leaving the rifle, but like in slow motion. Like this bullet is trickling out of the gun and slowly making its way, across the canyon, and he's just staring at this bullet. And then the bullet seemed to strike like an invisible wall of sorts. At which point the bullet actually stopped and almost like flipped inside out and sort of flattened and then fell to the ground. And then also as the flattened inside out bullet fell to the ground, Carl said he too fell to the ground and he blacked out. Now, when Marjorie heard this, her first thought was like, this is nonsense. This is not real. This is something maybe Carl's mind has created to fill in the gaps of his memory, because it's got to be really frustrating for him that he's got all these like fragments that he can't put together. And so maybe this is just his mind filling in the gaps with this really specific and weird imagery. But not long after hearing this story, Marjorie was doing the laundry and she was finally washing the clothes her husband had on when this whole thing happened out in the canyon. And when she reached into the pockets of his jacket to make sure they were empty before, washing the jacket, she felt something metallic. And she pulled out this round, like flat disc, this metal disc. And at first she just had no idea what it was. But then she thought about what her husband had said about the bullet from his rifle, flipping inside out and flattening and falling to the ground. She couldn't help but feel like this metallic disc that she's holding in her hand that was in her husband's jacket looks an awful lot like a bullet that has been flipped inside out and flattened. Like she couldn't believe it. Not long after this discovery of the alleged bullet, Marjorie sat next to her husband on a couch inside of an office at the University of Wisconsin. They were both sitting across from a psychology professor named Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Now, Marjorie knew this meeting was sort of a long shot, but she was hopeful that, maybe they would learn something valuable. So by this point, Carl had not recovered any other memories from his hunting trip. But after, recovering the supposed flattened bullet in her husband's jacket, Marjorie became convinced that something truly strange had happened to her husband. I mean, she obviously knew something happened out in the canyon, but now it just seemed like I don't even have any theories for what could have happened, but something really weird must have happened. And so she and Carl were both very determined to try to figure out what happened. And so that's how they ended up in Dr. Sprinkle's office. Dr. Sprinkle was not your average psychologist. He was a really big believer in hypnosis. He practiced hypnosis. And specifically, he believed that hypnosis could potentially allow people to access repressed memories, which is exactly what Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle, and Carl for that matter, believed was going on with Carl, that he had experienced something that was being repressed, but it was in there. You just need to find a way to access it. So that day in the professor's office, Marjorie stayed very quiet and just observed while Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to close his eyes, to relax his head down towards his chest, and just focus on his breathing, in and out, in and out. And after several minutes of this, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head back up. And Carl did, but when he looked up, his eyes were actually still closed. And at this point, Dr. Sprinkle asked Carl to tell him what happened on October 25th when he went elk hunting in McMarty Canyon. And Carl, with his eyes still shut, began to speak really fluently. And he began telling just the most insane story Marjorie, or Dr. Sprinkle for that matter, had ever heard. Carl said, again, under hypnosis here, that after he had watched that bullet leave his rifle in slow motion and hit this invisible wall and flip inside out and fall to the ground, he said that he too had fallen basically at the same speed as this bullet onto the ground, and basically he passed out. But he only blacked out for like a second. And when he opened his eyes, he said he was still lying on the grass in the middle of this canyon. except now standing over him was this tall, dark figure that was wearing almost like a very tight-fitting bodysuit, almost like what a scuba diver would wear. And Carl said this figure was vaguely, human-shaped, but it had very yellowish skin and very small eyes and no ears and no lips. And there were two antennas sticking out of, its forehead. And one of its arms extended into this flat stump, but the other arm seemed to have almost like a prosthetic attachment at the end of it that almost looked like a power drill. And then, in perfect English, this figure sort of looked down at Carl and just said, "How are you?" And Carl said he was so stunned by this thing speaking to him in perfect English that Carl just sort of blurted out, "Oh, pretty good, pretty good." And the figure seemed satisfied with this answer, and it went on to quickly explain that its name was Ozo-1, and it came from a planet 163,000 light years away from Earth. And it said it had no intention of hurting Carl. In fact, it said it wanted to help Carl. Then, with the hand that sort of resembled a power drill, it reached into what looked like a pocket on its bodysuit, and it pulled out this small packet containing 4 pills. And it told Carl that these pills would heal him. And then this thing offered Carl one of these pills. And Carl, for reasons he couldn't explain, just immediately took the pill and swallowed it. And then after that, Carl said that Ozo-1 asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl just said, sure. So Ozo-1 helped Carl off the ground. And then as soon as Carl was standing back up again, he saw there was this cube-shaped vehicle not far away. And a split second later, Carl said he was somehow inside of this vehicle, along with Ozo-1 and also 2 other vaguely humanoid figures and the 5 elk that he'd been out here hunting. They were behind this clear wall like a containment pen within the vehicle. And Carl was seated in a chair, as was Ozo-1 and the 2 other humanoids. They were all just sort of sitting there. Then Carl said he felt this powerful force push against his body, like the vehicle was moving so fast that it basically pushed him back into his seat. But less than a minute later, the vehicle just stopped, and Ozo-1 said, "We're home." At this point, Carl was just suddenly standing outside of the vehicle. And he said it felt very cold, and the sky was jet black. And then around Carl, the landscape was very different from planet Earth. It was very rocky and desolate without any trees or grass or really any organic-looking life anywhere. And then in front of Carl, he said he saw this massive metallic-looking tower that sort of reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. And there was this light on the top of it that was actually so bright that Carl said when he looked at it, it sort of hurt his eyes. And so Ozo-1 led Carl, the 2 other humanoid figures, and the elk to a door on the outside of this tower. And once they were standing outside of it, Carl said the door slid open, but instead of it sort of leading into the tower, it just led to what reminded Carl of the inside of a large elevator. And the whole group just got on board and began riding up. And then when this elevator of sorts came to a stop and the door opened again, Carl saw this small room with metal walls and a handful of what looked like platforms on the floor. Ozo-1 led the elk onto one of those platforms and told Carl to get on one too. And so Carl just did as he was told and stood on one of these platforms. And then out of nowhere, some kind of high-tech device emerged from these metallic walls and began sort of circling around Carl. It went from his head all the way to his toes, basically like scanning him. Carl was vaguely aware of the same process taking place to the elk as well. And then when this scanner was done, it made a beeping sound. And then Ozo-1 looked over at Carl and told him, well, the elk are what we needed, but you're not. So we're going to take you back to Earth now. And then Carl said the next thing he knew, he was just magically back inside of his work truck, like he had somehow been transported there instantaneously, and he was being shaken awake by those 2 sheriff's deputies. And so back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Marjorie is listening, just completely shocked by what her husband is saying, not even sure what to make of it. And then Dr. Sprinkle, at the end of Carl's story, when he got to the point where he's being shaken awake by the deputies, Dr. Sprinkle snapped his finger, and Carl kind of came to. He opened his eyes and sort of refocused, clearly out of hypnosis. And then they all just kind of sat there, like in total silence, really unsure what to say to each other. But as crazy as Carl's story sounded, there were several very strange facts about Carl's case that, up to this point, nobody had been able to explain. And the story that Carl told while under hypnosis technically accounted for all of them. The first fact that this story explained was that when Carl woke up in his work truck, like magically just appeared in his work truck, it was not just 3 miles away from the main road, it was actually 3 miles away from where he had originally parked it. And this truck was just sitting in a muddy bog with no tire tracks leading up to it. So it was just totally unclear how it got there. And so if you follow along with Carl's story, perhaps when he was transported back to Earth, they, this other creature and the other humanoids maneuvered the truck with Carl in it into this bog. The second strange fact is that when Marjorie had ballistics experts analyze that flattened presumed bullet that she had found in Carl's jacket, they were just as baffled as she was. Like, they could not come up with any earthly explanation for how a bullet could be flattened and turned inside out. Like, this was not possible. And so again, if you follow Carl's story, perhaps this being is the one that flipped the bullet inside out. And the third and perhaps strangest fact is that when hospital doctors gave Carl x-rays, they found something that should have been medically impossible. All of the tuberculosis scar tissue in Carl's lungs that had plagued him for decades, that had made it so hard to be physical and exercise, they had somehow disappeared. It was as if someone or something had healed him. Despite how unbelievable Carl's story sounded, and despite the fact that hundreds of people have spent decades trying to disprove it, no one has ever found a better explanation for the moving truck, the impossible bullet, and Carl's disappearing scar tissue. Because of that, some researchers believe that Carl Higdon's account could be one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever recorded. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballin Podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballin YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about mysterious disappearances. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Lava Tubes, and it's about 2 women who go for a hike in a part of the world that is known for its hundreds and hundreds of miles of underground tunnels. The second story you'll hear is called Stay in the Car, and it's about 2 people who go missing after a car crash. And the third and final story you'll hear is called What Just Happened, and it's about a woman who repeatedly calls 911 and then vanishes. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the liquid in the Follow Buttons hand sanitizer with glue. Okay, let's get into our first story called Lava Tubes. On September 19th, 2013, 69-year-old retired middle school teacher Amy Linkert and her friend, 63-year-old Joe Blakesley, who was a physician, headed off to the Craters on the Moon Park in Idaho. This park is actually a dormant volcano. It's not extinct. It's going to be active again, probably in the next 1,000 years. But for now, it's this beautiful park that is known for these crazy lava fields that look otherworldly. Barely any vegetation can grow on them, and there's just a strip of pavement they've kind of weaved through these massive jagged lava fields. And then you have all these big mounds that are the actual volcanoes. Another feature of this park are all the lava tubes underground. All the molten lava, when it jets around underneath the surface before shooting out, it carves these natural tunnels underground, these huge caverns. They're like these big caves you can explore. And there's 1,100 miles of lava tubes, tunnels, and caves underneath this park. The two women told their families they would be back in Boise, Idaho by the 21st, but when the 21st came and they were not home, their families were suspicious. They tried calling them, they didn't pick up, and for the next 36 hours, they just kept trying to call them and called around to see if anybody else knew where they were. And then finally, on the morning of the 23rd, when no one knew where they were, they reached out to the authorities. The formal search for these two women began on the 24th, so 5 days after they had initially left for this trip, and the searchers quickly found their pickup truck parked in the parking lot of the Craters on the Moon Park. And in their truck were their two dogs, who were alive, they were okay, and in the front seat were their purses and their cell phones, but there was no sign of Amy or Joe. This was obviously a bad sign, and so the search was really kicked into high gear to see if they could find these women before it was too late. But unfortunately, within 24 hours of finding the truck, they would find Amy's body. And her body was located way off of the main trail. She was in an area that the park superintendent described as incredibly rugged and inaccessible. Now, at this park, there is a strip of cement that weaves through this really dangerous lava field. And if you were on this strip of cement, you wouldn't be thinking about walking onto the lava field. Not only would you need to navigate all these massive mounds of jagged, cooled lava, there's all these cracks in the ground that you could fall through and just plummet to your death. So no one's about to start walking off the trail, especially not two older women that went here just to have a casual stroll through the park. They were not there for some grand adventure. They were not athletic distance hikers. It made no sense that Amy would be so far off the trail in an area that was so dangerous and so clearly off limits. When the families were notified that Amy had been found and they were still looking for Joe, the detail that the family keyed in on was the idea that these two women left their dogs in the truck. That was something so unbelievably uncharacteristic of either of them. They adored those two dogs. They would never, ever abandon them like that. In fact, because of that detail, the families jumped to this has to be foul play because they never would have done that. They wouldn't have abandoned these precious dogs. The search for Joe would continue. They basically shifted the entire effort to center over Amy where she was found and work in circles out from there to see if they could find her. They had helicopters flying overhead. They had mining experts walking through all the lava tubes below, and they couldn't find her. Finally, on October 23rd, so 28 days after Amy was found, Joe's body was discovered as well, and she was lying 1 mile away from where Amy had been found in a similarly inaccessible part of the park that would have required significant climbing over jagged, cooled lava fields and all these cracks in the ground she would have had to navigate to reach where she was. And even more strangely is the area where she was found had been searched extensively by air with helicopter pilots flying overhead and by cadaver sniffing dogs that had been in that area and they had not picked up her scent. So either the helicopter pilots and the cadaver sniffing dogs were just wrong or missed something, or Joe had not been there the whole time. A cause of death has not been determined for either of the two women. However, what was released is neither of them appeared to have suffered an incapacitating injury, meaning they weren't struck down where they were. They were traveling and ultimately stopped where they were. It seems highly unlikely that these two women abandoned their two dogs and left their cell phones in the car and then wandered way off the trail and separated from each other, all without supplies. But even if they had done that, even if they had, separated and left the trail, where they ultimately reached seems like an area they would not have been able to get to without assistance. And since they were separated, they weren't able to help each other get where they were. So although authorities have ruled out foul play, this was deemed an accident, it does seem like if there was ever a place to commit an attack, it would be this particular park, because underneath the park is 1,100 miles of lava tubes that connect to each other and weave all through the park. And there's hundreds of caves, many of which have not been found or explored, that it would be pretty straightforward to attack someone and then go underground and not be found. Certainly makes you wonder who or what could be hiding underground in those lava tubes. Our next story is called Stay in the Car. Before dawn on December 12, 1992, a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Dion sat in the passenger seat of a little two-door car that was swerving down a deserted road in the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Everybody in the car was drunk, including Tracy. Sitting next to Tracy in the middle front seat was her 19-year-old cousin named Ruby, and Ruby's boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Arnold, was driving the car. All three of them had been out partying all night, and so now they were trying to make it home. The swerving was making Tracy feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't want to say anything to Arnold in fear that she might distract him. I mean, it was really dark outside, there was no street lights, there was ice on the road. I mean, for a sober driver, this would be a challenging drive, let alone a drunk driver. They were coming up on an intersection, and Arnold brought the car to a stop with a lurch. Tracy watched as Arnold checked for cross traffic and then pulled out onto Highway 281. But halfway through this turn, as Arnold was accelerating, Tracy began to feel the car slide. And even in her drunken state, she could tell Arnold had hit a patch of black ice. And so as the car began to skid, she wanted to scream. Before she could, the car was already flipping over, and then everything went black. A short time later, Tracy came to. The car was upside down, and Tracy quickly realized she had fallen out of her seat and was now basically resting on the roof of the car, which was now on the ground. From what she could tell, after the car had finished rolling over, it had come to a stop just off the side of the highway, and so they were not in immediate danger from other cars striking them. But she couldn't really see outside because the windows were so badly cracked. Beside her, Tracy could hear her cousin, Ruby, pounding on the driver's side door trying to get it to open, and so Tracy tried to look around Ruby to see Arnold to see if he was okay, but when she did, she saw the driver's seat was empty. Tracy tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The driver's side door was closed, but Arnold was gone. Just then, Tracy heard the sound of the driver's side door opening, and she turned to see her cousin Ruby forcing the door open just a few inches, and then a second later, Ruby was slithering out through that crack to the outside. To Tracy, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She was too shocked and confused to make any sense of it. But if Ruby was getting out of the car, Tracy felt like she should too. And so Tracy turned and crawled across to the driver's side and was about to make an exit the same way Ruby had when the door slammed shut violently right in Tracy's face. Tracy didn't understand why Ruby would do something like that. Why would she shut the door that aggressively when she knew her cousin was still inside? Tracy tried to open the door again, but she was too weak to do it. She figured her cousin Ruby was okay, but she couldn't see outside because of how cracked the windows were. At this point, Tracy began to feel woozy. She laid her head down on the roof of the car, wondering to herself why Ruby and Arnold had left her behind. Tracy would stay trapped inside of the car, alone, for a few hours, until finally a motorist saw the flipped-over car and called 911. Shortly after that, first responders arrived on the scene, they pulled Tracy out of the car, and shockingly, she actually didn't have really any serious injuries at all. She didn't even need to be hospitalized. But rescuers could not find Ruby or Arnold anywhere. They were gone. And once rescuers had scoured the entire area around the crash site, the sheriff who was in charge of the scene started to wonder if Arnold and Ruby were not just missing. Maybe, he thought, they had fled. Arnold had been driving drunk, and all three of them were underage, and so the sheriff thought maybe Arnold and Ruby were scared to get in trouble. Over the next few days, the police continued to search the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby, hoping they were not badly injured and that they would just turn up on their own, but they never did. And as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wane for the young couple. Their family and friends kept searching the area along 281 where the car had flipped, looking for any clue as to where these two had gone. But there was nothing. There was no trace of them. It was like Arnold and Ruby had gotten out of the car and just vanished. But in January of 1993, so 3 weeks after the crash, strange and conflicting reports of sightings began to trickle in. First, a woman came forward claiming to have seen Arnold alive and well at a New Year's Eve party. Now, the police doubted this claim, but this woman was insistent that she had seen Arnold. And they actually hooked her up to a lie detector test, and she passed the test. And so officials brought in guests from this party who this woman claimed were with Arnold, and they asked them, "Were you with Arnold?" And they said no, but they failed their lie detector tests. Now, of course, this was suspicious, but police really didn't know what to do with this information. Assuming this woman's story was true, that she really did see Arnold, well, according to the details of her story, Arnold did not appear to be in any kind of distress. And even if he was in distress, the police still had no idea where he was, so how could they help him? Other locals came forward, claiming to have spotted Arnold around town as well. But nothing came of those reports either. Neither Arnold nor Ruby turned up. Months went by, and the case went cold. Until March 10th, when a driver was going down Highway 281 and they noticed a strange object in the drainage ditch next to the road. By now, the weather was much warmer than it had been on the day of the crash, so instead of snow and ice inside of this drainage ditch, it was runoff water. And the strange object was floating in it. The driver stopped his car, got out, and walked up to see what this thing was, and as soon as he saw it, he turned, ran back to his car, and called the police. Because what the driver had just found was a dead body. And when the police arrived and searched the area, they found another body not far away. The bodies belonged to Ruby and Arnold. But this discovery did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ruby and Arnold. Instead, it made it much more bizarre. Because first of all, the bodies were found 75 feet away from the original crash site. And the exact spots where the two bodies were found had been searched many, many times on the day of the crash, days after the crash. They were searched by police, they were searched by friends and family of Ruby and Arnold. The idea that this is where the bodies had been the whole time was impossible. They would have been found. And then there was the condition of the bodies. Ruby's body was extremely decomposed, which made sense given the fact that the crash was 3 months earlier. But Arnold's body was barely decomposed at all. And in the pocket of Arnold's jeans, police found a mysterious set of 3 keys. 1 was a vehicle key and 2 were house keys. But none of them opened any vehicle or building that Arnold was known to frequent, and nobody recognized them. Finally, the police found a tuft of hair lying near where the bodies had been found. It was Ruby's hair, but it didn't look like the hair had been there for very long, certainly not 3 months. Instead of being dirty and matted, like you would expect given how long she must have been there, the hair was perfectly clean. The official coroner's report on Ruby and Arnold's deaths were that they died of exposure, and then their bodies were just overlooked by searchers for months. But to a lot of people, including the sheriff who was in charge of the original crash site, this made no sense. Despite the coroner's findings, law enforcement officials believed that Ruby and Arnold's deaths were the result of foul play. Under the foul play theory, somebody pulled Ruby and Arnold out of the crash site while they were still alive, and then killed them later. And then perhaps they killed them at different times, which would account for the differences in decomposition of their bodies. The FBI ultimately came in and took over this case, but they eventually closed it down, citing a lack of evidence to support the foul play theory. However, with or without foul play being involved here, nobody has a good explanation for all those sightings of Arnold after the crash. And also, nobody can explain why the door was slammed in Tracy's face in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Maybe it was Ruby or Arnold who slammed the door, or maybe it was their killer. To this day, what actually happened on December 12, 1992, on the side of Highway 281 remains a mystery. The third and final story of today's episode is called What Just Happened. Growing up, Colton Louder was a joy to be around. He was always goofing off and making people smile, and he had a really infectious laugh. But secretly, he was depressed and began self-medicating at a very young age. By the time he was 18, he was a full-fledged drug addict, and by the time he was 25, he was in jail on a life sentence for murdering his uncle over a drug-related dispute. Colton's actions had a profound impact on his family, but none more so than on his twin sister, Kaylin. She had known about his pain even when he was putting on that facade of being happy and bubbly and outgoing, and she had reached out to him and tried to help him, but she could never get through to him, and when he was ultimately convicted, it was crushing to her. She felt like she couldn't help someone who was really vulnerable. But instead of just feeling bad about this, she took her sadness about her brother and watching him spiral and turned that into a laser focus on helping other vulnerable people that were struggling with addiction and depression to try to help them before they end up like her brother. And eventually she would get her degree in social work from Utah State. But despite Kaylin's best intentions to want to help as many people as she could, she found it very difficult to find work in her field, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have fairly long stretches of unemployment. And it was during one of those long stretches in 2014 that Kaylin's life rapidly fell apart, and it left everybody who knew her thinking, what just happened? On September 26, 2014, a little after 9 p.m., Kaylin calls 911. She reported that there was this huge, brutal fight taking place in her condo's clubhouse. Basically, it was like a restaurant where you could rent it out in the first floor of this condo complex. And she said it was getting out of hand and police needed to come over here and stop it before someone got hurt. The police asked her if weapons were involved. Were people using weapons in this fight? And Kaylin says, yes, guns. But when police rushed to the scene, bracing for the worst, they discover that it's just a docile wedding reception happening inside of this clubhouse, and not one person in there reported any altercation happening. They were like, we're being pretty quiet. I don't know where she would have got that from. One guest would tell police that they had lit off a single firecracker, but they showed them what they had used, and they were these little tiny cheap things that made almost no noise. So it is possible that Kaylin could have mistaken that for a gunshot, but it does seem highly unlikely. Police leave, and then 1 hour later, Kaylin calls 911 again, but she immediately hangs up as soon as an operator has actually answered the phone. And the operator calls the number back, and Kaylin picks the phone up, but she's not really speaking. She's mumbling, she sounds confused, and the operator said, hey, you tried to call 911 a minute ago. Is everything okay? Can you tell me where you are? And Kaylin would have a really hard time giving her address to the police. It was like she couldn't remember her address. And she's mumbling, and at some point she says, my roommate thinks I'm delusional and paranoid, but I'm not. Kaylin eventually kind of calmed down and said she was sorry for calling 911, and the operator said okay, and they hung up, and that was the end of the call. The next morning, Kaylin calls 911 for a third time in 24 hours. This time, she's frantic. While she's on the phone with the operator, she's periodically screaming at these two people that are apparently robbing her apartment to get the F out of here, get out of my apartment, you can't be here. And the operator is trying to get more information out of Kaylin, but Kaylin is very distressed. She can barely communicate with the operator. She's half crying, and the operator tells her, can you leave? Can you go somewhere safe? And Kaylin says, no, there's only one way out. This is a small apartment. I can't go past them. And the operator tells them that police are on their way. Just stay in your bedroom. Don't go anywhere. And so while Kaylin is huddled in her bedroom and the dispatcher is still on the line listening, you hear Kaylin's roommate, Carol, walk into her bedroom and very calmly say, Kaylin, what's going on? And Kaylin's like, Carol, get over here. You gotta lock the door. Get in here. There's two people in here. They're robbing us. They're out there. They're in the other room. And Carol's like, no. There's no one here. The front door's locked. Kaylin suddenly sounds really confused, and she says, well, I can't explain that, but they must have been in here because I heard them. They must have had a key, and that's how they got in, and that's how they got out. And right at that moment, the responding officers show up, and there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been taken. It really looked like nothing had happened, unless someone really did have a key. At this point, Kaylin was very embarrassed. She apologized to the officers, she apologized to her roommate, and she ended up calling her mom and saying, I'm mortified. I can't believe I just called 911 3 different times and nothing came of any of these calls. Like, I feel so embarrassed about it. And her mom, being a good mom, told her, don't worry about it. No one got hurt in the process, so it's all good. And so Kaylin moves past it, and on the call with her mom, she starts talking about what she's going to do that day. She says, well, I'm looking to update my resume and submit it to a couple different job openings, and I also want to clean up my apartment. And so they hang up the phone and everything seems normal again. But at about 5:45 p.m. that night, Kaylin, along with her beloved little dog named Phyllis that apparently she took everywhere with her, were seen exiting the condo and walking out to the parking lot behind their building. Kaylin was barefoot, was only wearing a tank top and shorts, despite the fact that it was cold and raining. And as soon as she puts her dog down, because she was holding her dog in her arm, Kaylin begins having this totally animated discussion, except there's no one there for her to be talking to. About 15 minutes later, she and her dog turn around and walk back towards the condo complex out of view of a camera, but residents would say they saw her crying and going up to a gate that lets you back into the condo, and she apparently couldn't open it. And as she's standing there struggling, she suddenly stops, puts her dog down, turns, and starts running away. And the camera footage we have of her is only when she's back in the parking lot, but she's running away still, and the dog is nowhere to be found. Her beloved dog, she's abandoned, she's got no phone, no wallet, and nobody knows where she's going. Later that night, when Kaylin's family could not get in touch with her, because of all the weirdness around those 911 calls, her family just had a bad feeling about it, and so they filed an official missing person report that night. When police arrived at the condo complex, the first thing they did is they reviewed the security footage. And they already knew about her 3 911 calls that had happened within 24 hours, and all of them had been for unfounded reasons. And they see Kaylin on camera, barefoot in a tank top and shorts in the rain, and she's having this animated discussion with nobody before running around and running away. And so police go to Kaylin's family and they say, does your daughter have a drug problem? Is she mentally ill? And her family tells the police, no, she's got no history of mental illness. She definitely does not have a drug addiction because of what happened to her brother. And they explain what happened with Colton and how that had a tremendous impact on her, and how that had actually sent her on a course to help people with mental illness or people who are fighting against addiction or depression. And they explained how she was just really well adjusted and everything seemed okay until these 911 calls started, and now this. So this huge search is launched between the police and volunteers. And actually the Louder family even hired some private investigators to help them look for Kaylin. But days turned into weeks and there was no leads. No one knew where she was. She just vanished. Then on December 1st, 10 weeks after she went missing, city workers were inspecting drainage pipes down near the Jordan River, which was a river that went by her apartment. And they discovered behind some plants a body that was half submerged, and it would turn out to be Kaylin's. They pull her out of the water and no cause of death could be accurately determined because of how long she had been in the water for. It looked like she had been in there for probably all of the 10 weeks she had been missing. They were able to determine that there were no drugs in her system and there was no water in her lungs, which meant she didn't drown. Her body was found 5 miles from where her apartment was, and so initial speculation was she must have gotten hurt and fallen into this river and drifted the 5 miles downstream to where she was found. But they looked at that section of the river between her apartment and where she was found, and the water was simply too shallow and windy, and it would not have been possible for a human body to travel that distance. Which means almost immediately after she ran off screen on the security footage, she covered those 5 miles, wound up at that section of the Jordan River, died, and then fell in the water, or fell in the water and then died, but not via drowning. The police officially ruled Kaylin's death an accident, but her family disagrees. They say if you look really closely at the security footage right before she runs away, it looks like she's terrified. More specifically, it looks like she's terrified of someone we can't see on camera. When she's having that animated discussion where it looks like she's talking to no one, further feeding the idea that she had kind of lost it, well, there's this huge rock to the right in the video that kind of obscures our view, and behind that is this huge forest. And it is theoretically possible that someone could be back there that we can't see. But no matter what, her family believes that whatever she was doing in her final moments on camera is the key to understanding why she ran off and ultimately died. So you be the judge. Was this a psychotic break, or is there something more? A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballin Podcast, as well as Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a cold December night in 2013, a 59-year-old widow stood on stage at a square dance club in Arkansas, watching some of her closest friends dance together. The woman had owned and run this square dance club for years, and the people out on the floor were just like family to her. But as she listened to the music and called out different square dance steps, she didn't notice that one of the dancers had their eyes fixed right on her. And the woman didn't know that this dancer had become obsessed with her. In fact, the dancer had started losing sleep just thinking about this woman. And now, the dancer had decided it was time to act, because they believed they would never find peace until the object of their obsession was dead. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the follow button a nice, refreshing cup of water while they run a marathon, but don't tell them you've replaced the water with Colite. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Monday, December 2nd, 2013, 59-year-old Patty Wheelington walked across a gravel parking lot toward her favorite place in Texarkana, Arkansas, the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Patty was the owner of the club, a spot where club members from town got together each week to socialize and square dance, which is a traditional type of partner dance that had once been extremely popular in the American South and West. Patty had managed the club for years with her husband Ray, but Ray had died a year earlier, leaving Patty to run things on her own with some help from the most dedicated club members. The couple had always considered Guys and Dolls to be like their second home, and now that Ray was gone, Patty felt like this club was the most important thing in her life. And tonight was her first day back at the club since taking a short trip for Thanksgiving, so she was looking forward to seeing some of her friends and getting back into her weekly routine. Patty opened the front doors, stepped inside, and her face immediately lit up. This old-fashioned dance hall was housed in a metal building that almost looked like a large storage unit from the outside, but the inside was bright and festive. String lights and decorations hung along the walls, and Patty saw a group of older women dressed in colorful western skirts and petticoats, and older men wearing their cowboy boots and hats. And everybody was socializing and laughing and having a great time while filling up their paper plates with food. The moment Patty walked inside, the club members turned, saw her, and shouted hello, and some rushed over to greet her like she'd been away for months. They told her they'd been anxiously waiting for her to come back because they hadn't known what to do with themselves while the club was closed over the holiday. She told them how much she missed them too, and thanked them for getting everything set up for the night. As she talked, Patty heard somebody calling her name. She looked over at a long table lined with food, and she saw two of her closest friends waving to her. They were Phyllis Neighbors and Virginia Hyatt. Patty went over to the table, and the women hugged each other and talked about their Thanksgiving holidays until Patty noticed it was almost time to start the night's dance. Patty walked across the dance hall, got up on the stage and tapped the mic, and then welcomed everyone back to the club. And immediately everybody cheered and took their spots on the dance floor with their partners. Well, at least almost all of them cheered. As Patty looked out from the stage, she noticed one of the couples whispering to each other while pointing her way. Patty almost tripped over her words as she began wondering if that couple was talking about her. But she quickly caught herself and figured she was just reading too much into it. So she wrapped up her welcome back speech and then led club members in saying the Pledge of Allegiance, which they did every time before they danced together. Once the pledge was finished, Patty, with a huge smile on her face, started the music and kicked off the dancing for the night. And as she watched everybody out on the dance floor, this sense of almost complete calm came over her. She knew most people would laugh at her for thinking this, but she believed being up on the stage and running this square dance club was her true calling. It was a way for her to give back to her community and to help the people she loved continue to thrive. The next morning, around 7:50 a.m., Patty stood in the kitchen of her home and poured herself a fresh mug of coffee. She slid her phone and pack of cigarettes into the pocket of her bathrobe and walked outside onto her front porch. A blast of cold winter air immediately hit her, so she pulled her bathrobe tighter across her body, sat down in a swivel chair, and set her coffee on a small wooden table and lit a cigarette. Now, in the past, on a cold day like this, Patty would have very likely just smoked inside of her home. But more than 5 years earlier, a raging fire had ripped through her home and destroyed half of it. Now, the blaze wasn't caused by a lit cigarette. In fact, the fire had started while Patty and her husband Ray weren't even at home. But they had hired a good friend of theirs from the Square Dance Club, who was a contractor, to restore their house, and he'd done such an amazing job overseeing the construction project that the house looked almost brand new. So now, Patty would never risk lighting a cigarette inside, no matter what the weather was outside. Patty smoked her cigarette and sipped her coffee, and just when she started to feel like she was really waking up, her phone rang. She put her coffee down and grabbed her phone out of her pocket. She looked at the caller ID and saw it was one of her many friends from the dance club, so she answered it. A few minutes into the conversation, Patty heard a car slowing down just beyond the trees at the edge of her property that isolated her house from the main road. Patty's friend kept talking on the phone, but Patty was no longer listening. She heard the car turning up her long gravel driveway toward her house, and she wondered who would be visiting so early without telling her they were coming by first. Patty watched as this car emerged from the trees and headed straight towards her. And as it did, Patty immediately told her friend on the phone that she'd just have to call them back. Over 7 hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Patty's close friend, Phyllis Neighbors, received a call from a mutual friend from the dance club. And as soon as Phyllis answered the phone, this mutual friend said he was very worried about Patty. Patty was supposed to pick him up to take him to a doctor's appointment, but she had never showed up and was not returning his phone calls, and this was totally unlike her. Over the next hour, Phyllis tried to reach Patty several times without any success. So eventually she called another friend from the club, Barbara Ricketts, and told her that she couldn't get in touch with Patty and she had this bad feeling that something might be wrong. Barbara said she had also been trying to get in touch with Patty and had not been able to reach her all day. And so at this point, Phyllis said that she was just going to drive out to Patty's house to see what was going on. But Barbara told Phyllis to hold on a minute and stay put and wait for her. She wasn't letting her go out there alone. By the time Phyllis and Barbara finally got to Patty's place, it was starting to get pretty dark. Barbara drove slowly and carefully up Patty's long gravel driveway because the light coming from inside Patty's house was actually the only thing guiding her way toward it. She parked right behind Patty's car, and the two women got out and started walking toward Patty's house. When they got close to the porch, they noticed something lying at the foot of the front door. Phyllis squinted and thought it looked like a bunched-up rug. Phyllis climbed onto the steps to get a better look at the object, and when she reached the middle step, she suddenly froze. And then she gasped and quickly turned her face away. She stumbled back down the steps, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911. Texarkana police cruisers and an ambulance converged on Patty's house within minutes of Phyllis's call. A police officer stepped out of his car and turned on his flashlight. He scanned the area and saw Barbara sitting inside her car and crying, and then he saw Phyllis standing in front of the porch. Her hands were shaking and she was muttering to herself. The officer, along with 2 EMTs, began walking toward the house, and as they did, Phyllis looked up and saw them and went right over to them and then pointed back at the front porch and said they might as well send the ambulance away because they were too late. The officer walked past Phyllis, reached the front steps, and right away he saw what she was talking about. In front of the door to the house, there was a woman in a bathrobe, lying face up, gripping a cigarette in her right hand and clutching her chest with her left. And the officer noticed that her skin was pale and blotchy. One of the EMTs walked over and bent down to feel for a pulse, but he was already confident he was not going to find one. And when he actually felt the woman's cold, waxy skin, it confirmed that she was dead. The officer kneeled down and shined his light on the body, and he saw there were bloodstains in the woman's bathrobe and blood spatter on the wooden slats beneath her. And it became very clear that this woman did not die of natural causes. Minutes later, another car pulled up the driveway and 2 men stepped out. Texarkana police detectives, Paul Knoll and Jason Hack, who were about as physically mismatched as 2 people could be. Knoll was round and bald, and Hack was tall and thin. They looked like an odd pairing, but these 2 men were actually almost always on the same page, and they were both sharp and meticulous investigators. Texarkana, Arkansas only had a few murders every year, so whenever Knoll and Hack got a call for a homicide, they knew it was not going to be an ordinary day at the office. And as they sized up their new crime scene, they could tell right away that this murder seemed especially out of the ordinary. The dead woman looked much older than the average murder victim in the area, and this neighborhood was more affluent than where they usually responded to violent crimes. Knoll and Hack quickly met with Phyllis and Barbara, but both women seemed so shaken they could barely talk. However, Phyllis did offer, in a very trembling voice, that the deceased was their friend, a woman named Patty Wheelington. Hack looked at the time and figured he should start canvassing the neighborhood while the neighbors were still awake. He told Knoll he'd be back in about an hour. As Hack walked to his car, he was struck by how eerily quiet it was. Even during the drive here, he had noticed how the woods seemed to isolate everything and how much land there was between each house. And as he pulled out onto the road to begin his canvassing, he didn't feel optimistic that any of Patty's neighbors would have witnessed anything. Meanwhile, Knoll stepped onto the front porch and began examining Patty's body and the area around her, trying to make sense of what had happened. For Knoll, there was no mistaking the 5 small, perfectly round wounds on Patty's body for anything other than gunshot wounds. He observed a bullet hole in the swivel chair where he guessed Patty had been sitting, and then another bullet hole in the bedroom window directly behind the chair. It looked as though the first shot was fired while Patty was seated, and it missed her. He then noticed another bullet lodged inside the front door of the house, which looked like yet another missed shot. Knoll took a step back, trying to picture the crime as it happened. He looked down at Patty and saw the cigarette wedged between her fingers, now burnt down to the filter. He noticed the way Patty's body was positioned, face up with one knee raised, and Knoll visualized Patty leaping up from her chair after the first shots were fired and desperately trying to retreat into her house as more bullets hit her until she collapsed onto her back. From how quickly it looked like things had unfolded and how the gunshot wounds appeared to have been fired from close range, this crime looked very intentional. It seemed like whoever had killed Patty had showed up on a mission, like they had come here to kill Patty. Knoll looked through the hole in the back of the swivel chair and then repositioned himself until he could see through the hole in the chair and also through the hole in the bedroom window, both at the same time, so they're aligned. This way, he could get a sense of the bullet's trajectory into the house. And while he was doing this, headlights suddenly swept across the porch as the coroner's van pulled up to the house. The coroner got out and met with Knoll, and Knoll told him he was free to remove the body. So, with the help of 2 police officers, the coroner lifted up Patty's body, placed it into a cadaver bag, and carried it off the porch. With the front door now clear, Knoll entered the home and went straight to the bedroom, where he found a .38 caliber slug on the bedroom floor, right where he calculated he would find it. He then began doing a walkthrough of the house, going from room to room, looking for any signs of ransacking or burglary. but nothing appeared out of place. In fact, it didn't look like Patty's killer ever entered the home. It was as if they drove up to the house, exited their car, immediately began firing, and once Patty was down, they got back into their car and drove away. Just as Noll started a search of the kitchen, about an hour after he'd arrived, his partner, Detective Hack, walked in and quickly brought Noll up to speed on what he had learned during his canvass of the neighborhood. Several of Patty's neighbors reported hearing gunshots around 8 a.m. that morning. After hearing this, Noll looked over at the half-empty pot of coffee still on the kitchen counter. He'd seen Patty lying dead in her bathrobe, and she had obviously been dead for at least several hours before she was discovered, so it definitely seemed like she'd been killed that morning, possibly around 8 a.m. But then Noll wondered why none of these neighbors had called the police if they heard gunshots that morning. Hack said he'd asked the neighbors the same question, and the explanation was pretty simple. People in that area fired their guns into the air all the time to scare geese out of their gardens or deer off their front lawns, so hearing gunshots would not exactly be cause for alarm. Then Noll started updating his partner on what he had found on the porch and inside the house as the two men searched the kitchen. But then suddenly, Noll stopped talking. He picked up several pieces of paper that were lying on the counter near the coffee pot, and as he read them over, he turned to Hack with a smile on his face. It looked like he had just found a huge piece of the puzzle. Noll handed over the papers to his partner, and after reading it over, Hack as well got the same look on his face. The first piece of paper was an invoice for a locksmith. Just a day earlier, Patty had paid someone to change all the locks on the doors to her house. Hack looked up at his partner with his eyebrows raised. If Patty was suddenly changing her locks at the house she'd lived in for years, it very likely meant she was afraid of someone who she knew well enough to maybe have a key to her house. Noll nodded in agreement and told him to wait until he saw what was on the other papers he had handed him. And as Detective Hack started reading those papers, his mouth fell open and he started shaking his head side to side, because what he was looking at was Patty's life insurance policy. Each of the beneficiaries listed in the policy stood to gain $20,000 in the event of Patty's death, and the last two names on the list were Phyllis Neighbors and Barbara Ricketts, Patty's friends, who also were the two women who had found her body. Noll and Hack arranged for police escorts to bring Phyllis and Barbara down to the station, and when the two women got there, Noll and Hack interviewed them separately in two different rooms. Phyllis told Detective Noll that she had first met Patty at the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club about a decade earlier, and she had been very close with both Patty and Patty's husband, Ray, and so had Barbara. Noll asked Phyllis if she knew that she and Barbara were beneficiaries on Patty's life insurance policy, and Phyllis began laughing and nodding. Noll couldn't tell if this laughter was maybe nervous laughter, or if it was designed to mask just how important this money may be to her. Phyllis kept on laughing and said Noll's question had reminded her that when she first learned that she and Barbara were beneficiaries, she had jokingly said, "Oh, real cool, Patty. You're younger than all of us. We'll all be dead before we see this money." Noll smiled at Phyllis and sort of played along like this was a good joke, but secretly, he thought that everything Phyllis was saying and doing made her seem a little bit suspicious. So, after she stopped laughing, Noll asked her to go through her day to help him establish a timeline, hoping that, if she was involved, she would implicate herself. Phyllis said she woke up at 8 that morning, and then sometime around 10, she sent Patty a text message. Phyllis said she didn't really think anything of it when Patty did not reply. She just assumed that Patty was still asleep, and then she got distracted when a friend came over to watch a television game show with her. Noll nodded and wrote everything down that Phyllis said, but privately, he wondered if maybe she had sent that text message to Patty just to throw off investigators and make it look like she'd been innocently trying to reach her friend on the morning of her murder. In the next room over, Detective Hack was asking Barbara a similar round of questions. And, like Phyllis, Barbara had an alibi. She said she was with her husband all day, and her husband could verify this. Hack leaned back in his chair and looked across the table at Barbara. As much as he tried to picture Barbara as Patty's killer, he just couldn't see it. Barbara reminded him of his grandma, and she looked so utterly shaken by her friend's death that it was hard not to feel sorry for her. But Hack had enough experience to know that he should never take anyone's emotional state at face value. This could all just be an act. And so as he sat listening to Barbara talk, he found himself calculating in his head how much money Barbara may have been willing to pay someone else to kill Patty in order to still turn a profit on that $20,000 life insurance payout. It was after 9 p.m. by the time detectives Nall and Hack wrapped up their interviews, but they didn't want to stop working right now when they felt like their investigation was really starting to take shape. And so after Phyllis and Barbara left the police station, the detectives began going through the text messages and recent calls on Patty's phone. They hoped they might find something that would give them more information on Patty's two friends. But none of the text messages between the women seemed in any way out of the ordinary. Instead, the detectives discovered something strange that they hadn't even been looking for. One of Patty's most frequent correspondents was someone she had saved in her contacts only as MF. Patty and MF communicated multiple times every day, and it was clear by reading their messages that this was more than just a friendly relationship. This was romantic. And it was also suspiciously discreet. Everyone else in Patty's contact list had been saved under their first and last names, except for this one person. Hack ran MF's phone number through a reverse directory, but all he was able to determine was that it was a mobile phone number, because the directory only gave him the name of the carrier, not the name that the phone number was registered to. And so he would need help from the phone company to find out who this number actually belonged to. But he also knew at this time of night that could be very difficult to make happen, and it could take a while. So Hack handed over that task to other members of the investigative team. And while he and Detective Nall waited for the results, they started tracking down and calling members of the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Even though it was getting late, several of the members answered their phones and were actually quite eager to help the police. None of the members could think of anyone with the initials MF, but Hack and Nall quickly discovered that these people loved to gossip. Several of them told the detectives that rumors had been circulating for a while that Patty was having an affair with a married club member, a man named James Hyatt. And as soon as Detective Nall and Hack heard this name, they stared at each other in shock. This was not the first time in this investigation that they had run across James Hyatt, because James Hyatt was the third beneficiary on Patty's life insurance policy, right behind Phyllis and Barbara. In the event of Patty's death, James, like Phyllis and Barbara, stood to receive $20,000. And so now the detectives had three possible suspects: Phyllis, Barbara, and James. And they also started to wonder if maybe all three of them had conspired together to kill Patty for the insurance money. In their conversations with Guys and Dolls Club members, Nall and Hack learned that James was married and he had known Patty for years. Patty and her husband, Ray, used to go out on double dates with James and his wife, and they had become even closer with James in 2008 when they hired him as a contractor to help restore their fire-ravaged house. In fact, Patty and Ray had trusted James so much that they had made him the executor of their wills. This definitely seemed like a guy who Patty and Ray might have given a house key to. So the detectives thought, maybe James was the person Patty had changed her locks to try to keep out. As the detectives were working through this potential theory in Nall's office, the door opened and an excited young cop walked in. He said they had gotten lucky. The phone company had been able to help them and gave them the name connected to the MF phone number in Patty's contacts. And it was a burner phone for James Hyatt. Nall and Hack immediately got in their car and drove across town towards James's house. They still considered Phyllis and Barbara suspects, and they thought there was a chance the women had worked together with James. But based on the text messages the detectives had found between Patty and this MF person, and now the burner phone, it seemed pretty clear that James and Patty were having an affair, which automatically made James a major suspect in his own right. On top of that, it made it even more likely James would have had a key to Patty's house, and as a final strike against him, he had something to gain financially from Patty's death. The detectives arrived at James's house, but his wife Virginia came to the door and told them James wasn't home. In fact, she had no idea where he was, and she was starting to worry that he might have just left town or something without telling her. And now, the detectives realized they might be looking at a fleeing suspect. They told Virginia to contact them if she heard from her husband, and to please keep her phone close by in case they needed to follow up with her. And Virginia said she would. Nall and Hack got in their car and headed right back to the station. It was late, and they were both very tired, but now this was starting to feel like a case they could close before sunrise. They just had to find James. Detective Nall walked into his office and called James's main phone, not the burner phone. There was no answer, but Nall was relentless. He just kept calling over and over and over, and finally, after a bunch of tries, Nall heard James answer. Before James could say anything other than hello, Nall introduced himself and told James why he was calling. But James cut him off, saying he'd already gotten the news of Patty's death, and so this would just have to wait, because he was out of town. Nall couldn't believe how arrogant and dismissive James sounded, and he was not convinced James was actually out of town. But either way, the detective knew he could not let James off the phone and risk having him disappear for good. Usually, Nall liked to interview his primary suspects in person, but he knew he could not wait for a face-to-face meeting with James. So Nall just launched into an interview right there on the phone. He told James that police knew all about the burner phone and his affair with Patty. There was no point in trying to hide those things. James immediately went silent, and there was a long pause, and then when he started talking again, all of the arrogance Nall had sensed just minutes ago was gone. James sighed and admitted that he and Patty were romantically involved. He only had the burner phone and the different name in her contacts to protect Patty's reputation. After all, he said, people in this town don't look too kindly upon adultery, and the other woman often gets blamed in these situations. So he just never wanted any of this to get out to protect her. Detective Nall doubted that it was really Patty's reputation James was trying to protect, and not his own, or his marriage. He asked James if Patty had ever demanded that he leave his wife, but James said she hadn't. In fact, he said Patty pleaded with him specifically to stay with his wife. Finally, Nall asked James where he was on the morning Patty had been killed. James said he'd been in Florida, where he still was, and so he was 1,000 miles away from Texarkana when Patty died. Nall knew that there was an easy way to either prove or disprove this, and that was by getting the location data for James's mobile numbers and seeing what cell towers they pinged. So he told James one more time that he needed to get back to Arkansas right away. As soon as Nall hung up, he and Detective Hack put in a request for a subpoena so they could get James's cell phone records. They knew that request would take a little time to be fulfilled, so in the meantime, they reached back out to James's wife, Virginia. They said they knew it was late, but they needed to talk to her. And not long after the call, the detectives drove back to James and Virginia's house, picked her up, and brought her back to the station. And by the time they arrived there, Detectives Nall and Hack weren't even sure if it was considered late at night or early in the morning. They just thanked her for coming in at such a strange time, and they led her into a large office with a conference table. Virginia sat down across from them, and for a second, neither of the detectives spoke. This was not a situation that either of them wanted to be in. But, finally, Hack looked across the table at Virginia and asked her if she was aware that her husband James had been having an affair with Patty. Virginia gave a little smile and said she knew it might sound strange to them, but she knew all about the affair. Hack and Nall shared a quick look, like what was going on here, and then Virginia told them that she and Patty were friends, and there were no problems between them at all. Now, neither of the detectives had expected this response, but they knew there were all different kinds of marriages out there. Maybe Virginia and James had an open marriage, or maybe James's affair with Patty somehow made his and Virginia's marriage stronger. They were not there to pick apart the exact nature of this relationship, but they did think there was a chance Virginia might have information that could directly connect James to Patty's murder, even if she didn't know it. And so Hack asked if Virginia remembered where her husband was when Patty was killed. Had Virginia seen James or even called or texted with him? Virginia said she hadn't seen James at all. She had woken up around 8 a.m. that morning, and she drove straight to a fast food restaurant to buy breakfast for her mother, who lived in a nursing home. After spending some time with her mom, she had gone home, and she said James had already been gone when she woke up, and he wasn't home when she got back, and they hadn't talked on the phone at all. The detectives excused themselves and stepped out into the hall. They had some new information, but nothing that would enable them to close the case or prove if any of their potential suspects were actually where they claimed to be at the time of the murder. They needed James's cell phone data. If his phone had been picked up by one of the cell phone towers near Patty's house on the morning of the murder, they would know he'd lied to them about being in Florida at the time of the murder. Luckily, it didn't take long for the phone company to come through yet again. Now, almost exactly 1 day after Patty's murder, Detectives Hack and Nall received James's cell phone tower data, which showed his location and movements throughout the morning of the murder. They also obtained surveillance footage from multiple locations around town, and that footage was the final piece of evidence they needed. It had taken just 24 hours, but the detectives now knew who had killed Patty Wheelington. Based on video footage, cell phone data, the interviews conducted, and other evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patty on the morning of December 3rd, 2013. Just before sunrise, the killer got out of bed after yet another sleepless night, and they told themselves there was only one way to find peace again. They had to kill Patty Wheelington. They went to their closet and collected their .38 revolver. As the sun began to rise, they slipped the gun into their pocket, marched out to their car, and began driving towards Patty's house on the outskirts of the city. The killer pulled into the long driveway leading to Patty's house, and as they approached, they saw Patty sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette and talking on her phone. The killer got out of their car and began walking toward Patty, who quickly put her phone down and greeted the killer. But the killer was not interested in talking. Instead, they drew their revolver and aimed it at Patty. Patty saw the gun and tried to reason with them, but the killer just fired off a shot. The bullet missed Patty and went through the bedroom window behind her, and Patty jumped up with her cigarette still in her hand, but before she could even turn, the killer had fired again, and this time the bullet hit Patty in the chest, puncturing her lung. Patty clutched her chest and struggled to breathe. She lurched toward her front door, but the killer kept on firing, hitting Patty 4 more times, including a bullet that struck Patty right in the heart. Patty's legs buckled and she collapsed on the porch, still clutching her cigarette in one hand and her chest in the other. And as the killer watched Patty fall, a sudden sense of peace did come over them. The killer walked back to their car, started the engine, and drove away as Patty lied at the foot of her front door, dying. A little while later, the killer stopped along an isolated road, disposed of their gun, and then continued on home. Over an hour later, at about 9:15 a.m., the killer drove to a fast food drive-thru and ordered a sausage biscuit. And at 9:42 a.m., the killer walked into a nursing home to see their mother and give her the fast food breakfast. And later that day, the killer returned home and waited for the sun to set, looking forward to their first good night's sleep since they discovered that their husband was having an affair with Patty Wheelington. James Hyatt, who had been a strong suspect at the beginning of the investigation, did not kill Patty. His wife, Virginia, did. James's cell phone data proved he was in Florida at the time of Patty's death, just like he had told the police. This information led investigators to immediately turn their focus on Virginia, who they had considered a suspect from the moment they learned she knew about James and Patty's affair. So investigators obtained surveillance footage from the McDonald's drive-thru and the nursing home, places Virginia told detectives she had visited on the morning Patty was killed, and those videos showed that Virginia had visited both of those places, but she lied about the times that she was there. And surveillance footage from a convenience store along the route between Virginia's house and Patty's showed Virginia's car heading towards Patty's house right around the time it was believed Patty was killed, and then also driving back to her own house not long after. With that information, police served a search warrant on Virginia's house. Although they didn't find the revolver, they did find a box of .38 caliber ammunition, and they found the blouse that Virginia was seen wearing in the surveillance footage from that morning. They sent the blouse to the crime lab, and it came back positive for gunshot residue. It turned out, ever since Virginia began to suspect that her husband was having an affair with their good friend Patty, Virginia became increasingly possessive and unstable. And James, who had been married to Virginia for 41 years, had begun to grow afraid of his wife, to the point where he began sleeping in a separate bedroom and even began locking his bedroom door at night to keep his wife out. At Thanksgiving dinner with her in-laws, a week before Patty's murder, Virginia had taken James's sisters aside and told them she was concerned that James was going to commit suicide. But James's sisters knew him well enough to know that they did not believe this, and when they talked it over with James, the family became convinced that Virginia was actually planning to kill James and cover it up by the idea that he had killed himself. So, as a result of this, James had left town to stay with his sister in Florida, and while he was down there, he filed for divorce. and by coincidence, Patty had just happened to leave town around the same time as James left for Florida, which led Virginia to believe that Patty and James had run away together. So Virginia began calling Patty repeatedly, leaving voicemail after voicemail, begging Patty to return her husband to her. On December 2nd, Virginia was served with the divorce papers. And then that night, she was at the Square Dance Club, where she knew the other club members were whispering and gossiping about her husband's affair with Patty, and so she decided it was time to kill Patty. And the following morning, she would. Virginia was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin Podcast. If you liked today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, the Mr. Ballin Podcast. We also have Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories, just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On January 17, 2001, a woman was exercising at her local gym in Amityville, New York, when suddenly she looked up and noticed something towards the back of the gym. At first she couldn't tell what it was, and so she wiped the sweat from her face, and then she looked again, and when she realized what she was looking at, she pointed and screamed. And what she saw would send fear all through the town of Amityville, a town that was already famously linked to mass murder and a possible demon possession. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button asks you if they can have a bite of your sandwich, tell them yes, of course. And then right as you're about to hand it over, immediately retract your hand and shove the entire sandwich into your mouth and turn around and walk away. Okay, let's get into today's story. In early 2001, 32-year-old Alex Algueri stood behind the front desk at the Dolphin Fitness Club in Amityville, New York. Alex loved the sounds of a crowded gym, the music pumping through the speakers, weights sliding onto bars, and people cheering each other on as they hit their fitness goals. And a crowded gym also meant that Alex was making money. He and his best friend, Paul Riedel, had opened up Dolphin Fitness 2 years earlier, and they had turned it into a favorite spot for serious weightlifters and amateur weightlifters alike. There was no question Alex was happy about all the money he was bringing in. He'd always dreamed of being a very successful entrepreneur, but the gym was a lot more to him than just a business. Amityville was a small town on Long Island with a strong sense of community, and Alex wanted his and Paul's gym to reflect that. So from the day they had opened Dolphin Fitness, Alex said he wanted everybody who stepped through the doors to feel like they were part of a family. It didn't matter if people were old or young or what kind of shape they were in. Alex went out of his way to help his customers feel good about themselves and to feel like they belonged, and his customers loved him for it. Alex stepped out from behind the front desk and began making his rounds on the gym floor. Alex was a really strong guy. He was just about 6 feet, maybe a little bit under, but he looked like a very serious bodybuilder, super jacked. So most people at the gym called him Big Al. Alex had dark hair and a dark goatee, and on this day he was wearing a long-sleeved black shirt and tight jeans, his standard outfit at work. Alex said hello to just about everybody on the gym floor. He knew pretty much everybody by name, and he was excited to see some new members starting off the new year by coming to his gym. Just then, a young man waved at Alex and asked if he wouldn't mind coming over and spotting him on the bench. And Alex said that was fine, and he walked over to the bench press, and Alex told the young man he'd be ready to grab the bar if the young man struggled to lift it. So the young man took a deep breath, he grabbed the bar, brought it down to his chest, and then in one slow but steady movement, he pressed the bar all the way up, and Alex spotted him the whole time shouting words of encouragement, and then finally when the young man had fully extended his arms and fully did a rep, he racked the bar, and he and Alex exchanged high fives and cheered like he just won the Super Bowl or something. Just then, Alex turned and saw a couple of people standing by the front desk. He figured they were potential new members. So Alex scanned the gym and then just shook his head. His partner Paul was supposed to be here right now working too, and really it would have been his job to talk to these two new potential members, but Alex hadn't seen Paul on the gym floor in hours. So Alex walked away from the young man he had just spotted and headed over to the front desk and smiled wide and greeted the couple. The rest of that night pretty much went the same way. Alex did everything and ran the gym, and Paul didn't show his face again. And by the end of the night, after Alex had said goodbye to the last customers and locked up, he was feeling frustrated. Why should he do all the work, but still give Paul half the profits? Alex angrily marched his way towards the back of the gym, past some aerobics rooms to a small office. Alex knew this is where he would find Paul. Alex opened the door, and there was Paul hunched over in a chair and tapping his fingers on a table. Paul didn't look up when Alex walked in. It was like he was off in his own world. Alex figured Paul must be high on cocaine or some other drug. It was a sight that Alex saw way too often. It made him mad because Paul was his business partner and he wasn't doing his job. But it also broke Alex's heart because Paul really was his best friend, and to see him struggle like this was hard. The two men had known each other for years, and they'd gotten along from the first time they'd met. They'd both grown up as working-class kids who dreamed of having their own business someday, and they both loved lifting weights and bodybuilding. So, after becoming fast friends, they began to come up with a plan to open their own gym. For years, Alex and Paul had worked different jobs to save up money, and they had also found some outside investors who believed in them. And so eventually, when they had scraped all the cash together, they opened up Dolphin Fitness together. Now, most people who knew them said these two were closer than brothers. Alex had been Paul's best man at his wedding, and he was the godfather to Paul and his wife Leanne's baby boy. Back in the office, Alex shouted Paul's name, and Paul finally realized Alex was in the room with him. When Paul turned around and looked up, Alex could see his eyes were totally bloodshot. Alex really laid into Paul for not helping him run the gym that night, and he said he didn't understand what Paul was even doing with his life. They had achieved their dream of starting their own business. And on top of that, Paul had a beautiful wife and child, so why was he throwing everything away on drugs and partying like he was still a crazy bachelor in his early 20s? Paul was very defensive and shouted a few obscenities at Alex, and then basically just told Alex to leave him alone. But Alex said he'd had enough. He told Paul that he was ready to dissolve their business partnership and go start his own gym if he had to. That got Paul's attention. He stood up and walked right towards Alex. And Alex was a big guy, but Paul was like a giant. Paul was 6'7" tall with a massive chest and huge arms. And Paul just started screaming, and Alex screamed right back. But Alex knew Paul was not someone to mess with when he was high and also angry. So pretty quickly, Alex just said he was done talking for the night, and he walked out of the office. From the hallway, Alex heard Paul scream at the top of his lungs, and then he heard the sound of an office chair go flying into the wall. Alex angrily clenched his jaw, picked up his pace, and grabbed his coat from behind the front desk. Then he headed out the back door of the gym to the parking lot, he climbed into his black Yukon SUV, and took off. And as he drove, he figured Paul was still probably screaming and throwing more furniture. The following day at the gym, Paul apologized to Alex. Alex was used to this. His friend would do drugs, he would lash out, say stupid things, and then feel bad about it the next day and say he was sorry. Alex accepted Paul's apology like he always did, but he just felt tired from having to deal with the same thing over and over again. Alex was all about family, and he loved the people close to him almost unconditionally. But even he was reaching a breaking point with Paul, and he knew he was not the only one who felt this way. Paul's wife, Leanne, was also fed up with Paul's drug use and angry outbursts. In fact, she was so upset with her husband that she'd gone to stay with her mother in Florida until she could figure out if she even wanted to stay married. Alex knew that Leanne leaving had made it really hard on Paul, but he couldn't blame her. After all, the night before, Alex had threatened to leave Paul and go start his own gym. And Alex had meant what he said, but he knew scrapping the Dolphin Fitness Club and trying to start his own gym would not happen overnight. So Alex decided to look at all of his options and start putting together a new business plan. That way he would feel like he was working towards something. And in the meantime, he hoped and prayed that Paul would get his life together and go back to being the great business partner and best friend that he used to be. A couple of weeks later, on the night of January 17th, 2001, Alex was back behind the front desk at the gym. Paul had taken a couple of nights off, which left Alex to run the place on his own. But Alex was used to that, and he really hoped the time away from the gym would do Paul some good. Alex made his usual rounds on the gym floor, talking to customers and encouraging the weightlifters, and then at some point, he heard a woman who was over on the exercise machines shout "Big Al" over the music. Alex turned and smiled at the woman and began walking over to her. When he reached her, she was very sweaty and out of breath, and she told him right away how excited she was about all the results she was seeing from all her exercising, but she told Alex that she just could not get on board with the music that was playing, and could he please change it? Alex laughed and said of course he would change it, but she told him there was actually this one particular album that really motivated her to work even harder at the gym, and she said Alex had played it during a fitness class that she'd taken from him. And immediately, Alex knew exactly the song she was talking about. He said he had the CD in his car, and he'd just go grab it. Then he turned away from the woman and began walking towards the back door. The cold air hit Alex as soon as he walked out to the parking lot. It was around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, so just above freezing. Alex's coat was still hanging up inside the gym, but it wasn't worth going back for. He'd spent enough winters in Amityville to be used to this kind of cold. So Alex hustled across the parking lot to his black Yukon. When he got to it, he opened up the driver's side door, and the dome light came on. Alex leaned into the SUV and started digging through the CDs that he kept in a case in the passenger seat. Then Alex heard someone shouting behind him in the parking lot, so he pulled his head out of the SUV and he turned to see what was going on, and when he did, he saw someone running directly towards him in the darkness. Back inside the gym, the woman who had asked Alex to change the music, she wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked off towards the back exit. Alex had been gone way longer than she thought he would be, but she figured he must be just having a hard time finding the CD, or maybe he'd stopped in his office to make a phone call before coming back to the gym floor. But then the woman saw something, and she screamed. Several people stopped their workouts and ran to her to see if she was okay, but she just pointed towards the back of the gym, and then more screams rang out above the music. Alex staggered onto the gym floor. Blood poured down his neck and soaked through his shirt. People ran up to him and he looked at them, and in a strangled voice he said, "I've been shot." Alex collapsed to the ground. A woman who was a nurse rushed to his side and checked his pulse and immediately began administering CPR. At the same time, a man ran to the front desk and grabbed the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, police and paramedics arrived at the gym, and right away Alex was put on a gurney and rushed outside to a waiting ambulance. Someone had turned off the music by this point, so everybody in the gym just stood there in stunned silence. Most of them were in shock, and they couldn't understand what had even just happened. Everybody loved Alex. Why would someone shoot him? The local police stayed to question everybody at the gym about what they had seen, but their main goal was simply just to get names and contact information for everybody who was there. They knew that a violent crime like this one, that had seemingly just occurred, would quickly be handed off to a larger police force, and so they just wanted to gather up some names to hand off. A couple of hours later, Detective Robert Anderson of the Suffolk County Police Department stepped out of his car in front of the hospital. Anderson looked and dressed more like a professor than a cop, and people who had worked with Anderson during his 34 years in law enforcement said he had a mind like a professor too. He was highly analytical and rarely satisfied with simple answers. Detective Anderson had gotten word that Alex Algueri had been shot outside of the gym that he owned, and Alex had been declared dead soon after being rushed to the hospital. From the minute Anderson was told he would be leading a homicide investigation in Amityville, he knew there would be a ton of pressure on him to solve the case fast, because Amityville was not your typical town. Amityville, for decades, had been associated with murder and dark forces. Almost 30 years earlier, in 1974, an Amityville man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. had killed his mother, father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters in their home. The media attention from the mass murder was bad enough for the small, quiet town, but things had only gotten stranger for Amityville after that. The family that wound up moving into the DeFeo house where those murders happened claimed they were terrorized by a demon or some other supernatural entity in the house. This claim eventually drew the attention of very famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who came out and did their own investigation, and the story of this demon or entity in the home also was eventually turned into a book called The Amityville Horror. And that book has since been spun off into movies and TV shows. I mean, Amityville really became synonymous with evil. And so Detective Anderson knew that Amityville community leaders had worked really hard over the years to kind of correct their image. They didn't want to be known as this violent or cursed town. But this brutal shooting in a gym parking lot threatened to put Amityville right back in the national news for all the wrong reasons. Anderson walked into the hospital and found his way to the private room where Alex's father was waiting for him. Alex's father wiped tears from his face, cleared his throat, and introduced himself to Anderson. But before Alex's father could say much more than his name, he broke down in tears again. Even after 34 years as a cop and dealing with some of the most notorious murders on Long Island, nothing could really prepare Anderson for meeting a parent who had just lost their child. It was the worst kind of loss Anderson could imagine, and seeing Alex's father in so much pain really hit him hard. He told Alex's father how sorry he was for his loss. Then Anderson said he hated to put him on the spot at that moment, but he did need to know if there was anyone who might have wanted to hurt his son. Alex's father wiped away his tears and then told Anderson that Alex was the sweetest, kindest man you'd ever meet, and that everybody who knew him really loved him. But then he said there definitely was one person who could have done this to his son: Alex's best friend and business partner, Paul Riedel. It turned out Alex had told his father all about Paul's drug use and his partying, and he had also told him that he was thinking about scrapping the business with Paul and going out on his own. Anderson thanked Alex's father for his help and told him how sorry he was again. Then Anderson left the hospital and drove back to the station. He wanted to gather as much information as he could on Paul. It didn't take long for Detective Anderson to discover that Paul had had more than his fair share of run-ins with the law. He had served time in prison for drug charges and armed robbery, and he had previously been linked to an illegal sports gambling ring. But Anderson knew that did not mean the man had killed his best friend, so for the time, Anderson put Paul's police record to the side and dug more into his personal life and his relationship with Alex. The local Amityville police had passed along contact information for everybody they found at the gym when they had first arrived there. And when Anderson and his team reached out to those people, they all said pretty much the same thing. Alex was like family, and everybody loved him. But Paul, he was a mess, and he definitely was capable of shooting Alex. Some of Alex's family and closest friends were even more straightforward when they spoke to Anderson. They said they were sure Paul had to be the murderer. So Anderson knew he would just have to go talk to Paul, but he didn't want to drag Paul to the station and chuck him inside of an interrogation room just yet, because he feared as soon as he did that, all of Amityville would decide Paul really was guilty. And so that could potentially destroy an innocent man's life, and it could put even more pressure on police to arrest someone before they were actually ready. So Anderson actually came up with a fairly outside-the-box way to question Paul that was not super formal. Now, it was not going to be ideal by any means, but it was an opportunity Anderson didn't want to miss. His team would talk to Paul at Alex's funeral. Days after Alex's murder, a line of cars stretched out down the street in front of a local funeral home, and they wrapped around the corner. Hundreds of people had come to pay their last respects to Alex. Detective Anderson filed into the funeral home behind a group of mourners. It was common for investigators to attend funerals for homicide victims. It gave them a chance to watch how potential suspects acted. But Anderson was really just there to observe Paul and to see if he could get any information from Paul after the service was over. Anderson watched as Paul made his way to the front of the chapel inside of the funeral home. And it immediately became clear to Anderson that it didn't matter to other people that Paul had not been brought in for questioning yet. Clearly, they had already decided Paul was guilty. People literally shouted at Paul as he walked down the aisle towards his best friend's coffin. They told him to leave and said how dare he show his face here. Paul didn't engage with any of them. He just stared at the floor and clung to his wife Leanne as he walked. Detective Anderson couldn't get over how small this enormous guy seemed to look at this very moment. But Anderson didn't know if he should feel sorry for Paul or if he was just being too cautious and too analytical. Maybe everybody else was right. Maybe this case was clear-cut and Paul really was the killer. Anderson watched as Alex's friends and family talked about how much Alex had meant to them and how proud they had been of him. Alex's father fought back tears and spoke about all the special times he'd shared with his son. Then he broke down and said Alex would never get to experience those kind of moments with a child of his own because someone had taken that chance away from him. After the funeral was over, Anderson and some other members of his team separated from the throng of mourners and followed Paul and his wife Leanne outside. The investigators approached, and as they did, Paul suddenly stood up to his full height. Suddenly, the small, kind of sad-looking man Anderson had seen inside had disappeared. Paul now looked angry and huge. Clearly, he did not like the fact that police were bothering him at his best friend's funeral. Anderson assured Paul they were only trying to get some basic information. So Paul just said he loved Alex, he would never hurt him, and on the night of the murder, he said he was with friends in another town. For a minute, Anderson figured his big plan to try to question Paul at this funeral was going to turn into a total bust. But right as he was about to give up on this approach, something suddenly stood out to him. Paul's wife, Leanne, was standing next to her husband doing her part as a very supportive spouse. But Anderson had briefly spoken to Leanne in the days following the murder, so he knew that she and Paul had serious problems in their marriage and that she had even gone to Florida to get away from Paul. And so now Anderson wanted to know if she had had like a big change of heart about her husband, which is why she was now being so supportive, or if she was acting supportive out of fear. If Paul had really killed Alex and Leanne knew about it, was she just afraid she'd be next if she didn't support him? On January 23, 2001, so 6 days after the murder, Detective Anderson met with Leanne at her grandmother's house in a small town that was not too far from Amityville. Leanne was short and thin with long brown hair, and she sounded like a native New Yorker. She led Anderson into a warm, rustic-looking kitchen, and they sat down at the table. Anderson didn't want Leanne to feel like she was being interrogated, so when he spoke to her like they were just two friends catching up. Anderson asked Leanne about the funeral and how she felt when she was there, and very quickly she made it clear that she had not gone there out of fear or anything like that. She had been there because she loved her friend Alex, and she wanted to support her husband Paul. She said that despite their marital issues, they really had been working hard on their marriage. But Anderson wasn't convinced, and so he pressed Leanne a bit, and he asked what had happened that made her leave New York and go to Florida in the first place. Leanne said she'd left because Paul was partying and doing drugs, and she felt like that was a terrible environment for her kid. But Leanne was clear that she did not believe Paul would ever kill his friend Alex. Sure, the two men fought sometimes, but they were like brothers, and brothers fight. She knew Paul loved Alex. Anderson said he understood, and then he asked her if there was anything else she could think of that might help with the investigation. Leanne shifted in her chair and then looked around the room like she was trying to make sure nobody else was listening. Then she leaned closer to Anderson, and in a quiet voice, she told him there was something going on that he needed to know about. Paul had gotten into trouble with the mob, and he had actually received a rat card in the mail. Anderson hid his surprise pretty well, but this was news to him. He knew Paul had a police record and that he'd been linked to some low-level criminals who might have loose ties to the mob. But receiving a rat card meant that members of the mob believed Paul had sold them out to the police, an unforgivable offense in the world of organized crime. Then Leanne told Anderson that things had actually gotten even worse after that. At a big party a year earlier, Paul had gotten into this big public argument with a man who wound up being a captain in the Gambino organized crime family. At the time, the Gambinos were one of the most powerful mafia organizations in New York City. Leanne said Paul never told her what the argument was about, but she was pretty sure he owed a lot of money to some very powerful people. Detective Anderson listened quietly, and he still didn't show anything on his face, but he knew this case might have just taken a major turn. It was one thing for Paul to be connected to some small-time criminals in Amityville, New York, but it was a whole different thing for Paul to be in debt to high-ranking members of a New York City mafia family. Anderson talked to Leanne a little while longer, and then thanked her for her time. He headed out to his car and drove back to Amityville. In the course of only a few hours, Anderson had been forced to take a completely different view on this case. He still considered Paul a suspect, but now Anderson had a totally new theory as to what could have happened. He thought maybe the mafia had put out a hit on Alex, so Paul's best friend, as a way to warn Paul, "Pay us the money you owe us, or you'll be next." In February of 2001, so about a month after Alex's murder, Detective Anderson got word that Paul and Leanne had reconciled and repaired their marriage. But there was more to the story than that. Paul had moved with Leanne and their kid down to Florida, and members of Alex's family and a lot of other people in Amityville were up in arms about it. Many people in the community had never stopped believing that Paul killed Alex, and now they thought Paul had left the state to run away from the crime he had committed. The pressure on Anderson to arrest Paul continued to grow, and some people questioned whether Anderson was even doing his job. But Anderson understood their frustration. He also wanted to bring Alex's killer to justice. But he wasn't just going to cave in and arrest Paul because he actually didn't have any concrete evidence against Paul. Anderson's team had confirmed Paul's alibi for the night of the murder, and they'd combed over the crime scene at the gym multiple times, and nothing they found directly linked Paul to Alex's murder. On top of that, Anderson was following up on leads that connected Paul to the mafia. He was supposedly in debt to dangerous men, he had had that public fight with a member of the Gambino family, and Alex's murder did seem to look like it could have been a mob-style hit. So Anderson remained focused and calm, and he kept pursuing all of the possible leads in the case. He also told his team not to be swayed by public opinion. Just because others had already made up their minds about what had happened did not mean they needed to do that too. But over the next month, Anderson hit one dead end after another. He couldn't discover any definitive links between Paul and the Gambino family or any other high-ranking members in the mafia. Then, in April, so 3 months after Alex's murder, Anderson found out that Leanne was pregnant. And this news sparked another round of anger from the Amityville community and threatened to make Anderson's job even harder than it already was. People were outraged that Paul was allowed to carry on with his life and watch his family grow after he had robbed his best friend Alex of a chance to start his own family. Anderson continued to sympathize with the people who were frustrated with him. He knew they just wanted answers. So Anderson kept working every angle of the case he could think of, but he felt like he was running out of time. He needed a break in the case to help appease his loudest critics and to at least give Alex's family some hope that justice would be served. On November 11th, 2001, so almost 10 months after Alex's murder, a detective from the New York City Police Department sat across a table from a guy in custody and listened to him rambling about how he could help the police. The NYPD detective almost found the whole thing kind of amusing. It was pretty common for people in custody to try to cut a deal by giving up information on crimes that were even worse than the ones they'd committed. A lot of times, though, the so-called leads these people provided went absolutely nowhere. But occasionally, some leads would pan out. So the detective sat there with a slight smile on his face and just listened. But then the guy in custody said something that really caught the detective's attention. And so his smile disappeared and he leaned forward and told the guy to slow down and repeat what he just said. The guy nodded and leaned in closer, almost like he and the detective were on the same team. Then he repeated what he had just said. He said he knew who had killed that gym owner in Amityville and he knew why they killed him. Now remember, Amityville is a small town about 2 hours away from Manhattan, and so criminals trying to cut a deal with the NYPD did not usually reference small town crimes like this one. So the detective sensed this could actually be legitimate. So he got all the details he could from this guy in custody about Alex Aguirre's murder. Then the detective walked out of the room, went to his desk, and made a phone call. A second later, an officer with the Suffolk County Police told Detective Anderson there was a call for him from an NYPD detective. The officer said that this detective was calling with information about the Alex Aguirre case, and it could potentially break the case wide open. Anderson walked to his desk, and as he did, he felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the first time in months that he actually might have a possible new lead. On the phone, the NYPD detective told Anderson about the conversation he'd just had with the guy in custody. Both detectives were well aware that desperate people under arrest were not usually the most reliable sources because they basically will do anything to get out of custody, but the NYPD detective thought the information he'd gotten was actually worth passing on. Anderson listened to the detective and scribbled down the name of a man that he needed to track down. Anderson thanked the NYPD detective for his help, and then he quickly rounded up his team and told them they might finally have a major break in the Alex Aguirre case. The information Anderson got from the NYPD detective led him right to a man who was supposedly involved in Alex's murder. The man was clearly struggling with drug addiction, he seemed jittery and all over the place when he spoke, and he spun a wild story about how and why Alex had been murdered. At first, Anderson wasn't sure he could believe anything this man told him. But Anderson and his team dug deeper into the man's story, and several of the details checked out. And after that meeting, it would still take Detective Anderson several months to put everything together, but he finally had evidence connecting someone directly to Alex's murder. Based on interviews conducted throughout the investigation and evidence found at the scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of January 17, 2001, when somebody murdered Alex outside of his gym. At about 7 p.m., a white minivan drove past the Dolphin Fitness Club. Inside the van were two people. There was the driver and also the killer. And the killer was scanning the area for the perfect spot to stake the place out. Both people inside the van wore zip-up hooded sweatshirts, and the killer rested a .38 caliber pistol on his knee. The killer pointed to an empty parking space on the street that had a clear view of the employee parking lot. So the driver drove around towards the back of the gym, pulled the van into that parking space, and then turned off the engine. Then the driver and the killer kept their eyes fixed on the employee parking lot and made small talk to pass the time. The killer figured it could be hours before they could make their move, but they were willing to wait as long as it took, because this area, this employee parking lot, offered the best place to shoot someone without being seen. The lot was dark, and only a few people ever parked there. The killer checked their gun to make sure it was loaded, then they, along with the driver, just kept on talking and watching the parking lot. But then, just 20 minutes later, the killer suddenly sat up in the passenger seat and leaned in closer to the window. The wait had not been long at all. Their target was already in the parking lot, walking towards his black Yukon SUV. The killer told the driver to start the van and to be ready to speed out of there. The killer clutched the pistol tight in one hand, then opened the door with the other, and walked into the parking lot. The killer saw Alex open up his car door and lean inside, and as he did, the dome light came on. Not wanting to be too close to the light, the killer shouted something at Alex just to get his attention and to kind of pull him away from his vehicle and the light. And it worked because Alex turned to see who was yelling at him, and he took a few steps away from his car towards the killer. And at that point, the killer just rushed out of the darkness and got within a couple of feet of Alex, who had no idea what was going on, and the killer raised his gun and fired before Alex could do anything. The first bullet hit Alex square in the chest. Then the killer squeezed off 3 more shots, one right after the other. Bullets struck Alex across his upper body, perforating his heart and both of his lungs. Then the killer fired off 1 more shot, which hit Alex in the neck. Alex fell to the ground, covered in blood. At this point, the killer turned and ran back to the white van. The killer never saw Alex pulling himself up and staggering back towards the gym. As soon as the killer was back inside the van, they slammed the door shut and yelled for the driver to go. So the driver whipped out of the parking space and sped down the street. A few minutes later, the driver heard ambulance and police sirens on the other side of the road, so they eased off the gas. They didn't want to draw attention to the van. When they were a few miles away from the gym, the killer spotted a creek just off the side of the road. So they rolled down their window and hurled the gun into the water. Then they told the driver to floor it, and the van sped down the road again. Not long after that, the driver pulled onto the highway, and the van headed south, far away from Amityville, New York. The following night, the killer and the driver sat in the killer's living room reading an online story about the murder. The shooting outside the gym had made the national news, but the killer and driver read the story more than once because they could not believe what they were seeing. Then the front door opened, and before the killer could even say anything, a woman barged in and shouted at him at the top of her lungs, "You stupid bastard, you killed the wrong guy!" It would turn out Leanne Riedel, Paul's wife, had set up the hit outside of the gym. But Alex was never the intended target. Leanne had wanted her husband, Paul, dead. And the killer, a man named Rocco Salerno, had been more than happy to oblige, because it turned out that Leanne and Rocco had been having an affair since Leanne had left New York and went to stay with her mother in Florida. Leanne and Rocco had fallen in love and wanted to start their lives together, but Paul was in the way. To make things worse, Paul had already filed with a court in New York to begin divorce proceedings. And if Paul and Leanne got divorced, well, New York law would require Leanne to come back to the state and live within 50 miles of Paul so he could see his son. But Leanne didn't want to leave Florida and Rocco, so she and Rocco hatched a plan to murder Paul. Rocco paid a guy he knew $3,000 to drive him to New York, scope out the gym with him, and serve as his getaway driver after the shooting took place. So, on the night of the murder, Rocco and this driver are sitting there and they see this huge guy walk into the parking lot, and he goes to his black Yukon, and Rocco thought this was his target, because Paul was also a big guy who happened to own the same make and model of black Yukon that his best friend Alex owned. So Rocco rushed out of the van and gunned down Alex in cold blood, not realizing he had shot the wrong person. When Leanne discovered what had happened, she came up with a way to try to fix things. She reconciled with Paul so he wouldn't divorce her and make her move back to New York. Then she convinced Paul to move to Florida because so many people in Amityville, including his friends, were treating him like a murderer. And then once they were back in Florida, Leanne just continued her affair with Rocco. And her plan was to divorce Paul after both of them had become Florida residents, because that way she would not be forced to leave the state. And all of this came to light after the guy in custody with the NYPD told police he had information about Alex's murder. It turned out the guy in custody actually happened to know the driver of the white minivan, and so this guy in custody had actually heard all the details of everything that had happened during the murder. So Detective Anderson tracked the driver down, and he discovered that the driver was struggling with a drug problem, and the driver said that's why he had accepted the $3,000 to drive Rocco to and from the gym in Amityville, and the driver quickly cut a plea deal, and he would give authorities everything they needed to bring Rocco in. But even with Rocco in custody, Leanne denied having anything to do with the murder. She said she had always loved Paul and that they had even had a second child together. Leanne also tried to act like she barely knew Rocco. But soon it became clear that the child that Leanne had recently given birth to was not her husband Paul's, it was Rocco's child. And at that point, all of Leanne's denials about her role in this murder quickly fell apart. The actual killer, Rocco Salerno, was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Leanne, she was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder as well, and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She continued to maintain her innocence and appealed her conviction, but the appeal was denied. Alex's best friend Paul might have had some demons, but he had nothing to do with his friend's murder. Paul was granted custody of his and Leanne's child, and with his child, he returned to Amityville. He ended up renaming the gym Big Al's Family Fitness in honor of his fallen friend, and Paul has said that he strives to live his life and run his business with the type of integrity and kindness that would make Alex proud. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts, and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. Go check it out. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 3 crazy stories about political assassinations and professional hits. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Bug Bite, and it's about a reporter who feels a pain in his leg and assumes it's just a bug bite. But the truth was much worse. The second story you'll hear is called Professional Job, and the series of events in this story are so crazy it really should be made into a movie. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Dispatch, and it's about one of Japan's darkest moments caught on live TV. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the Amazon Music follow button a nice hot cup of coffee when they wake up, but then proceed to make them an extremely weak cup of coffee with too much milk and way too much Splenda. Okay, let's get into our first story called Bug Bite. In 1978, 49-year-old Georgy Markov, who was originally from Bulgaria, was living in London and working as a reporter for the British Broadcasting Company, or BBC for short. Georgy had moved to London 6 years earlier, and in the early days of him being in the UK, he would always take a cab or a bus to work. But over the last couple of years, he had taken to walking to work. Not only was it great exercise, but he also just loved the scenery. In particular, he liked on his commute to stop on the Waterloo Bridge, this very famous bridge in London, where from that position he had a beautiful view of the Westminster Palace on one side, and he had the iconic London Eye on the other, which is a very famous Ferris wheel. So on the morning of September 7th of that year, Georgy got up and he left his flat, and he began his typical commute into work. However, by the time he reached the Waterloo Bridge and was getting ready to take in the sights, it had started to rain, and Georgy did not have an umbrella. And so instead of sightseeing, he just kept on walking as quickly as he could to try to get to his office before he got completely soaked. But by the time he was just on the other side of the Waterloo Bridge and still had quite a distance to cover to get to work, the skies had completely opened up. And so as much as Georgy wanted to walk, because this was something he really enjoyed, he decided it was not worth it. And so he began looking for a bus stop, and he found one pretty quickly, and he rushed over to it. There was an awning that the commuters could stand underneath, and so he ran underneath this awning, getting out from under the rain, and then he proceeded to wait for the next bus to take him the rest of the way. As he stood there waiting, he suddenly felt a shooting pain in the back of his right thigh. And instinctively, without even knowing what it was, he just reached down and grabbed his leg, but he couldn't feel anything. And then he tried to kind of look around and look down at his leg, but it was just too crowded around him, so he really couldn't do it. And so he's standing there puzzled, still grabbing at his leg, wondering what could have caused this pain. And the only things he could think of were, maybe someone near him had a pen or a pencil out and they accidentally poked him, or maybe it's some sort of bug that bit him, a spider or a bee or something. He didn't know, but there weren't that many scenarios that made sense to him. But before he could spend very much time dwelling on what had caused this, the bus arrived and Georgy turned around, he hopped on board, and by the time the bus pulled up in front of his office building and he had gone through the doors of the BBC, Georgy had effectively forgotten about this pain in his leg. But when he got up to his actual desk and sat down on his chair, when the underside of his thigh made contact with his chair, it sent that shooting pain into his leg, and immediately he noticed it. It was almost like he had a splinter stuck in the back of his thigh, and by pressing it down on the seat, it was driving that splinter deeper into his leg. And so Georgy stood up immediately, and he's grabbing at the back of his leg, and he's kind of craning his head to look down at the back of his leg, but he doesn't see anything there. And so he's standing there wondering what he should do. He's got a really busy day ahead of him, and he's thinking, should I maybe go to the bathroom and see what this is? But then he tells himself, you're overthinking it. This has got to be something minor. I need to get to work. And so he sat back down in his chair, being very careful with his right leg when he placed it down so as not to press too hard on the spot that hurt. And then he just got to work. And over the course of several hours, even though he knew there was kind of a dull, aching pain in the back of his leg, he mostly forgot about it. He was just doing his job. But by the second half of the day, in the early afternoon, the pain in his leg had become so excruciating that Georgy was literally gritting his teeth and sweating profusely in order to try to ignore the pain. But at some point, it just became too much. He couldn't focus on work, and so he stood up, he left his desk, and he walked down the hall, and he went into the single-stall bathroom. And once he went inside and he shut the door behind him, he pulled his pants down and turned around and looked in the mirror to use the reflection to look at the back of his leg. And right away, there was a little bit of a relief there, because what he saw was a little bit of redness, a little bit of swelling, but nothing significant. It looked very much like someone must have hit him with a pencil by accident, or maybe it was a bee sting or a spider bite or something, but whatever it was definitely minor, at least in Georgy's mind. And so he pulls his pants back up, he tucks his shirt back in, he leaves the bathroom and goes back to his desk. And then he sits down, and despite this intense pain in his leg, he's convinced himself it's no big deal, and so he just kind of grits his way through the rest of his workday. When he finally got home again and walked through the door, Georgy's wife looked at him and was like, "What's wrong with you?" He was so pale, he was sweating profusely, he looked awful. And so he told her about what had happened with his leg, and he was still trying to kind of write it off. But she told him, "Georgy, you are sick, there's something wrong, we have to go to the hospital right now." And so at this point, Georgie was miserable, and so he agreed to go. And so the pair, they made their way over to the emergency room at the hospital. They go inside, and a doctor pulled Georgie into an exam room and said, okay, tell me what's going on. Why are you here? And Georgie would explain how in his morning commute, he had stopped at this bus stop and then felt this shooting pain. And then he told the doctor, I'm pretty convinced this is someone who might have accidentally jabbed me with a pen or a pencil, or it's a bug bite, a spider bite. I don't know what it is, but I'm convinced it's something minor. And so the doctor, he hears this, and he asks Georgie to stand up, pull his pants down so the doctor can get a look at the site. And so Georgie does. He gets up, he drops his pants, and then as the doctor bends down and begins looking at the back of his thigh, Georgie kind of turns around and looks down, and he's shocked at what he sees. Even though he does not have a full view of the back of his leg, it's obvious that the swelling and redness on the back of his leg has grown exponentially. It looks totally horrible. And so after a couple of minutes of the doctor looking at the back of his leg, the doctor stands up and looks puzzled and tells Georgie, hold on a minute, I need somebody else to get a look at this. And so the doctor goes out into the main hall. He comes back with another doctor, and that doctor comes over. He bends down and he looks at the back of Georgie's leg as well. And after the two of them kind of talk to each other and they're looking at the back of his leg, they stand up and they walk around and they're facing Georgie now. And they say, okay, this is going to sound totally weird, but when you were at the bus stop, before you felt the pain in your leg, was anyone around you holding a snake or a reptile? I know that sounds crazy, but the mark on the back of your leg looks exactly like a venomous bite. So Georgie's like, no, I didn't see anyone with snakes or reptiles. There was nothing out of the ordinary about what was happening around me when I felt this pain in my leg. We were all just standing there, and then I felt it in my leg. That was it. And so the doctors would tell Georgie that, they didn't really know what was going on with his leg. And so the best thing to do here is just to admit him to the hospital and monitor him and, try to run some tests on him and try to make him comfortable. And so that night, Georgie was admitted to the hospital. He was set up in his own hospital room. And right away, the nurses and doctors began administering different combinations of medicines and treatments to try to lower the swelling and the pain in his leg. But it just seemed like nothing was working. And so all night, his condition seemed to get worse, not better. And then the next day when he woke up, his leg was much, much worse. It was extremely swollen. It almost looked like a balloon that had been completely filled. It was very red. And Georgie himself was also beginning to lose touch with reality. He had become convinced that someone had tried to kill him, and that was why he was so sick. And this delusion of his got so extreme that he was afraid of his doctors and nurses. And so it became a big challenge trying to help him because he was effectively fighting them off. By the next day, Georgie's condition overall had become critical. He was very clearly on the brink of death, and his mind was effectively gone. But the doctors and the nurses really had no idea what was going on with him, and so there was nothing they could do to help him. And then on the last day he was in the hospital, the third day, Georgie would die. His body just shut down. Given the strangeness of Georgie's death, his body was sent for an autopsy to try to figure out what had caused that leg pain, because that seemed to be the trigger that ultimately killed him. And sure enough, during the autopsy, the coroner made a surprising discovery. Buried in the back of his right leg, right underneath the site that was where he felt the pain, was this little piece of metal. It was so small, the coroner actually almost didn't see it. But when he did see it, he put it under the microscope, and what he saw was this obviously man-made metallic disc that had these two small reservoirs drilled into it. And so they sent this disc off for further testing, and what they discovered was there was ricin residue inside of those two reservoirs. Ricin is an extremely powerful poison. It is more lethal than cyanide, and it has no antidote. And the symptoms of ricin poisoning often look like the symptoms of other diseases or illnesses, and so it's very difficult to diagnose. And so as a result of these factors, ricin is a very popular poison for assassinations. And the belief is that that is exactly what happened to Georgie. He was assassinated. But to this day, we don't actually know who assassinated him. However, the running theory is that Georgie, who was a reporter for the BBC, he covered politics, and he often spoke very critically about the Soviet Union. And so this theory goes that the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, known as the KGB, they assassinated Georgie for what he was writing about. Adding credence to this theory, a former KGB officer named Oleg Kaligan, who was exiled to the United States in 1991, he claimed that he oversaw the assassination program that targeted Georgy Markov. He said what they did is they put this little tiny disc, that metal disc with the ricin inside of it, they put that at the tip of an umbrella, and they made sure the disc itself was fairly sharp. And then the KGB assassin with this umbrella simply followed Georgie on his typical morning commute, and then when he stopped at that bus stop, the assassin jabbed him in the back of the leg and then faded into the crowd. According to Oleg, those little metallic discs that had the ricin inside of them, they were actually covered with a thin layer of wax, and only when this disc had been placed inside of the target's body would their body heat melt that wax layer off, exposing the poison, and then their target would die several days later, as Georgie did. However, Oleg's story, despite being as compelling as it was, didn't have any hard proof to back it up. And so to this day, there has been no one officially charged with Georgy Markov's murder. Our next story is called Professional Job. In 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old loan officer at a Chase Bank in Houston, Texas. On the morning of October 12th, Mary Lou said goodbye to her husband, Jay, and she headed off to work. That afternoon, Jay gave his wife a phone call, but she didn't pick up. He left her a message, and she never got back to him. This was very unlike Mary Lou, and so Jay was a little bit concerned. At 5 p.m., when he still hadn't heard from her, Jay called her back, but again, she didn't pick up. So Jay called Mary Lou's supervisor, who informed Jay that Mary Lou had actually not come to work that day, and they couldn't get in touch with her either. Jay immediately knew something was wrong, and he called the police. The police had not even begun searching for her when a call came into the station from an ATV rider that happened to be on a road about 3 miles away from Mary Lou's house. And he said he spotted a smoldering car, and it looks like there's someone in the driver's seat that's obviously deceased. Earlier that day at about 10 a.m., the fire department had gotten a call about smoke in that area, but they assumed it was a controlled burn, so they didn't investigate. When the police arrived on scene, it was impossible to tell who the person was that was sitting in the driver's seat, but they were able to find a tooth fragment, and they used that to confirm that it was in fact Mary Lou Morris. It was quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide, and her attacker had probably set this up to make it appear like it could have been self-inflicted. Gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the vehicle. However, because of how badly damaged the car and she was, they couldn't determine a cause of death, so they weren't sure if she was deceased when she was placed in the car and it was lit on fire, or if she was in the car and the fire was the cause of death. A number of Mary Lou's valuables were still inside of the car, but her wedding ring was not on her finger. Mary Lou's family and the community at large were shocked. They just could not understand why anybody would want to target such a nice person that had no enemies. The day after Mary Lou's death, a local Houston newspaper received an anonymous call from a guy who just said Mary Lou's death was an accident. And the newspaper tried to get more information, but the person hung up and they couldn't trace the call. At the same time this drama was unfolding for Mary Lou Morris, another drama was unfolding for another Houston woman with the same name. 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris was a successful nurse practitioner who by and large got along with all of her coworkers with one exception. A new employee at the clinic, a male nurse named Dwayne Young, was making her feel really uncomfortable. One day when Mary McGinnis got back to her desk, she found all of her pictures of her family had been flipped onto their faces, and in the middle of her desk was a piece of paper that just said death to her. And she knew right away this had to be Dwayne, but she had no way to prove it. And so that night when she went home, she told her husband, Mike, about this guy, Dwayne, and she said, I don't feel safe at work. Can you teach me how to shoot a gun? And so he did. He taught her how to shoot a gun, and then he went out and got a pistol, and she tucked it under her driver's seat in her car just in case. On October 16th, so 4 days after Mary Lou Morris was found dead, and 3 days after that anonymous phone call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris was at a drugstore after work. And as soon as she went inside, she noticed there was this strange man on the other side of the store that was just watching her. She called her best friend Lori to tell her that there was this strange guy and wanted to know what to do. And Lori said, wait for him to leave. But the guy didn't leave. He just stayed in the store and stared at Mary. And so eventually Mary said, you know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I got to stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be totally fine. And so Mary hangs up. She buys what she needs. She leaves the store. And then 12 minutes later, she places a frantic 911 call saying someone's trying to kill her. And this 911 call was not made public because apparently on the tape, you can actually hear her being attacked. Mary McGinnis was found later that night in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her 911 call that she had been attacked, and so this was almost certainly a homicide. However, her attacker tried to stage it so it looked like it was self-inflicted. The murder weapon, which was actually her pistol that was tucked underneath her seat, had been placed next to her hand on the seat next to her. None of Mary McGinnis's valuables were stolen. However, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After Mary McGinnis Morris's death, people began to speculate that her death and Mary Lou Morris's death were connected. Specifically, this was a professional hit gone wrong. The reasoning for this theory is there was just too many coincidences. They shared the same name, they lived in the same city, they were killed within days of each other, and both of their deaths were staged to look like they were self-inflicted. And each woman was missing their wedding ring, which apparently is a common way for professional hitmen to let their clients know that the job was done. The people that subscribe to this theory believe Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target and Mary Lou Morris was just an accident. And in fact, after killing Mary Lou Morris, the hitman must have realized, whoops, I made a mistake, and they called the newspaper to say, literally, that was a mistake. And then a couple of days later, the hit was successfully carried out on Mary McGinnis Morris. The police looked into this theory and they discovered that Mary McGinnis's husband, Mike, had recently accused her of cheating on him, and he was really, really upset about it. He also refused to take a polygraph test and would not allow his daughter to talk to the police. And Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy that Mike was in line to receive. And so immediately everybody's like, okay, obviously Mike put a hit out on his wife and that's what started this whole thing. But when they dug into it, they realized that no matter how upset Mike was, there wasn't any evidence that tied him to the killing of his wife or to Mary Lou Morris. And so he was ruled out as a suspect. As for Mary McGinnis's co-worker, Dwayne Young, who wrote "Death to Her" on her desk, it was clear that he did not like Mary, but he was ruled out as a suspect as well. And unfortunately, that's where both of these cases go cold. To date, no one's ever been charged in either murder. The next and final story of today's episode is called Dispatch. Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it was, it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid. What he's talking about can't be serious. And when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on. And then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm. And then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya at this point was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our other studios podcasts, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the early morning hours of February 9th, 2014, 17-year-old Lexi Sachs was asleep in her bed inside of her parents' mansion in San Juan Capistrano, California. And as she lay there, suddenly there was this loud bang on her door that woke her up. And instinctively, Lexi just pulled the covers up over her head like she did when she was a little kid and was scared. And as she lay there under her covers, she held her breath and stayed totally still, hoping the sound she had just heard was actually from her dream and not in real life. But then she heard her little brother begin to scream in the hallway. And at that point, Lexi jumped into action. She threw the covers off and ran out of her bed, out of her room, into the hall. And what she found at the end of the hallway would not only turn her and her siblings' lives totally upside down,
but it would also leave one of the safest and wealthiest communities in the entire country in total shock. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please kindly rob a bank and leave clues behind that frame the Amazon Music follow button. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of February 6th, 2014, 54-year-old entrepreneur Andra Sachs lit 2 candles on top of a cake, then started singing Happy Birthday as she carried that cake out of the kitchen inside of her sprawling mansion in San Juan Capistrano, California. 3 of Andra's 5 children joined in the singing and followed their mom. Andra was 5 foot 11 inches tall with dyed blonde hair, and she was the type of person who could take over any room she walked into. So even a simple chorus of Happy Birthday with her kids felt like a big production whenever Andra was leading it. As Andra, her 2 teenage daughters, and her 8-year-old son continued to sing Happy Birthday, they walked past a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Their huge 3-story house sat on top of a hill, and the windows looked out over the Pacific Ocean. Then Andra and the kids walked into the dining room, where Andra's ex-husband, Brad, was sitting at the dining room table smiling. Brad was over 6 feet tall, he had salt and pepper hair, and he almost always had a tan. Andra put the cake down on the table, and then she and the kids finished singing Happy Birthday. Brad leaned over the cake and blew out the 2 candles that were shaped like a 5 and a 7. The kids cheered, and Brad thanked them all for singing. Andra smiled at Brad, but she noticed he was hiding his hands just below the dining room table. She knew why Brad was doing it. It was because he didn't want the kids to see the tremors that were making his hands shake. 2 years earlier, Brad had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which is a disorder of the central nervous system that can include symptoms like muscle stiffness, loss of balance, and tremors. And recently, Brad's symptoms had gotten worse. The kids knew their dad was dealing with Parkinson's, and so they were used to the changes in his movement that the disease could cause. But that night, Brad was celebrating his 57th birthday, and he just wanted the kids to have a good time and not worry about him. So he kept his hands out of sight while Andra cut up pieces of the cake and handed them out to the kids. Then Andra sat down next to Brad at the table, and she rubbed his back. Andra watched the kids laughing and eating their cake. Then she told Brad she wished their 2 oldest sons, who were away at college, could have come home to visit for his birthday so the whole family could be together. Brad said it was all right, and he pointed out that before they knew it, the girls would go off to college, and their 8-year-old boy would grow up, and it would just be the 2 of them together most of the time, like it had been at the beginning of their relationship. Andra and Brad had met almost 25 years earlier when they were both starting out as entrepreneurs in the growing tech industry. They were both very smart, and they had great minds for business, but other than that, they seemed like they didn't have much in common. Andra had grown up without a lot of money. In fact, there had been times as a child when her parents struggled just to make mortgage payments. As she got older, Andra had told herself she never wanted to experience anything like that when she was out on her own. So after she earned a business degree in college, she had worked hard to develop her sales skills and to learn about as many industries as she could in the hope that she would always have job security. Andra was full of energy, she could talk to anybody, and she could be intimidating. And those traits had helped her find success as a salesperson at a pretty young age. But Andra was also driven and fixated on success. So she had wanted to be her own boss and to make even more money. So by the time Andra had met Brad, she was already formulating plans to start and run her own company. Brad had first seen this tall, stunning, laser-focused woman at a computer convention back in 1990, and he was totally floored by her. Unlike Andra, Brad had come from money. He was the son of a legendary Southern California surfer, and Brad had wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps. So he'd spent a big part of his life traveling and surfing waves on beaches all over the world. And Brad embraced the laid-back surfer attitude. He almost never raised his voice, he never looked like he was in a hurry to get anywhere, and nothing really seemed to stress him out. And so when Andra and Brad had met, it really was a case of opposites attracting. Brad had been drawn to Andra's drive and energy, and Andra had been drawn to Brad's kind of quiet, calm demeanor. The two had gotten married a year after they met, and they'd started a family soon after that. They had their first son, Miles, and he was followed 2 years later by his brother, Ashton. Then, a few years after that, Andra and Brad's first daughter, Lexi, was born. In the dining room, Andra and Brad watched 17-year-old Lexi gather up wrapped birthday presents with her 8-year-old brother, Landon. Andra appreciated that Lexi went out of her way to take care of her little brother because Andra spent a lot of time working and she wasn't always around. And as Brad's Parkinson's progressed, it was more difficult for him to do certain things around the house and to look after Landon all the time. But there was something about watching Lexi with Landon that always made Brad and Andra a little sad. It wasn't the kids' fault, but seeing them together brought up memories of the worst time in Brad and Andra's lives. Less than a year after Lexi had been born, Andra and Brad had welcomed another daughter, and as their family grew, their businesses had grown alongside it. Andra and Brad had started multiple companies together and also separately on their own. Then, Andra had used some of the profits from one of her companies to invest in rental properties and to build a massive real estate portfolio. In her time as an entrepreneur, Andra had often said it was easy to make money, but keeping it was the hard part. So she saw real estate as a way to protect her and her family's money and to build on the wealth that she had started to make from her other businesses. It turned out that Andra was a very savvy real estate investor, and soon after getting into that business, her investment properties were bringing in millions of dollars. So Andra, who had been determined never to face the financial struggles her parents had gone through, felt like she had already accomplished more than she could have hoped for. She was making more money than she had ever imagined, and she and Brad had just bought their first house together. It was a modest house compared to the mansion on the hill they would move into years later, but it had a beautiful pool and also had a hot tub. And the happiest part of Andra's life was that she and Brad had 2 perfect sons and 2 perfect daughters. But on a day in 1999, 15 years before Brad's family birthday party, 2-year-old Lexi and her 16-month-old sister had been at home with a nanny while Andra and Brad were working and the 2 boys were at school. While the nanny fed the baby in her high chair, Lexi had walked out of the house into the backyard and onto the deck by the pool and the hot tub. Inside the house, the nanny had seen Lexi out the window, so she grabbed the baby from the high chair and rushed outside. Lexi was close to the pool, and the nanny panicked. She put the baby down on the deck and then reached out and grabbed Lexi. But when the nanny had grabbed Lexi, the baby had somehow fallen off the deck into the hot tub and drowned. Following the death of their youngest child, Andra and Brad felt like everything they built together had just been destroyed. It didn't take long for them to start blaming each other for what had happened, and the tensions at home spilled into their work, and pretty soon each of them had tried to push the other one out of the businesses they owned together, and their marriage fell apart. Andra and Brad had gotten divorced, but things had only gotten worse from there. They had sued each other over business assets and personal finances, and Andra had even filed a report with police stating that Brad had tried to physically assault her. During this time, their 3 living children, Miles, Ashton, and Lexi, had clung to each other for support and tried to make both of their parents happy. Miles, the oldest, had seen himself as the one in charge, the one who was responsible for taking care of his younger siblings, and the other kids followed Miles's lead. But only a couple of years after the ugly divorce, Andra and Brad reconciled. Their friends and family had been shocked, but Andra and Brad seemed happy, and they had moved into the mansion on the hill in San Juan Capistrano that Andra had bought with money from her real estate investments. So the family was back together again. And then Andra and Brad had expanded the family by adopting Landon and his older sister. But after the divorce, Andra had sworn she would never share her money with Brad again, so she and Brad had not gotten remarried, and the house and most of the family's assets were still under Andra's name. In the dining room, Lexi and Landon brought in one final birthday present for Brad. It wasn't wrapped, but it had a bow on it, and when Brad saw it, he lit up. It was a large water bicycle designed to let him ride the ocean waves while sitting on top of it. Parkinson's disease had taken surfing away from Brad, but now, with this water bicycle, he'd be able to get back in the water. He thanked the kids for the great birthday party, then he turned to Andra, gave her a kiss, and thanked her for the incredible gift. They both knew a lot of people did not understand their relationship, an ex-husband and wife living together without getting remarried or sharing their money, but they didn't care, because Andra and Brad believed that they and their kids were as happy, successful, and loving as a family could be. On February 8th, 2014, so 2 nights after the birthday party, Andra helped Brad to their bedroom on the 3rd floor of the house. They hadn't told their younger kids yet, but Andra had recently purchased a new 1-story property, and she was going to sell the home they lived in. Andra and Brad knew the kids would be disappointed to move out of the mansion on top of the hill, but it was getting too hard for Brad to deal with the size of the house and to navigate all the stairs, and so Andra wanted a place where he could get to everything he needed on just 1 floor. While Andra and Brad went to their bedroom, 17-year-old Lexi walked into her little brother Landon's room on the 3rd floor and said goodnight to him as he got ready for bed. Then Lexi and her 15-year-old sister played with the family dogs and talked about school for a little bit before Lexi headed to her own bedroom, which was just down the hall from her brother's. Lexi got dressed for bed, she laid down, she looked at her phone, and sent a couple of text messages to friends. After a while, she put her phone on the bedside table, flipped off the lamp, and then went to sleep. A few hours later, at about 1:45 in the morning, Lexi woke up, startled. She thought she heard a loud noise coming from down the hall, but she didn't know if it was real or if maybe she'd been dreaming. Then, Lexi heard something bang against her bedroom door, and the door flew open. Without thinking, Lexi immediately held her breath and pulled the covers up over her head like she had done when she was a kid when she got scared. She heard a loud noise, but obviously couldn't see it, and then something smashed into the wall just above her. Lexi tried her best just to be totally still and not make a sound, but then she heard footsteps running down the hallway, followed by her little brother Landon screaming. Hearing her brother calling out made Lexi jump into action. She threw the covers off of her, she got out of her bed, ran into the hallway, and she saw Landon lying on his chest a few feet outside of his bedroom in the hallway, and he was screaming and crying and saying he couldn't feel his legs. Then Lexi heard footsteps again coming from behind her, and immediately her body tensed up. But then she turned around and saw it was just her sister running towards her. Lexi yelled for her sister to go call 911, so her sister turned around and ran back to her room on the 2nd floor to get her phone and make the call. Lexi turned around and looked down at Landon and promised him he would be just fine and that she needed to go somewhere, but she'd be right back. And then she turned and ran down the hall towards her parents' room. And when Lexi got inside, her screams carried across the entire house. "45 minutes later, at about 2:30 in the morning, detectives Justin Montano and Mike Thompson of the Orange County Sheriff's Department drove past a set of large palm trees as they headed up the hill towards Andra and Brad's house. The house was surrounded by a wall with a gate, but the gate was open. Detective Montano drove through the open gate, and he and Thompson saw an ambulance and several squad cars parked out front. The detectives stepped out of their car and looked up at the 3-story mansion. Both of these detectives had handled cases in similar Orange County neighborhoods, but they were still taken aback by some of these huge multi-million-dollar properties like the Saxes house. Montano and Thompson made their way up to the mansion and walked inside. One of the first officers who had arrived at the scene met them and led them through the foyer to a large staircase and up to the 3rd floor. Montano and Thompson walked down the 3rd floor hallway past Lexi's bedroom, and they saw members of the forensics team examining spots of blood on the floor outside of Landon's room. The detectives followed the officer to the main bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was open, so before they even stepped into the room, they could see inside, and they could see there was blood covering the back wall. And they could see there were 2 bodies still lying in the bed. They were Andra and Brad, and they both were deceased. Montano thanked the officer for leading them to the bedroom, and then he and Thompson stepped into the room and walked towards the bed. Neither of them could get over the amount of blood that was covering the sheets. Montano thought this looked more like a gangland hit than a typical homicide. A ballistics expert waved the detectives over and showed them multiple bullet casings he'd already found in the room, but there was no murder weapon left at the scene. Montano went back to the officer who had led them to the bedroom and asked him what he and the paramedics had found when they first entered the house. The officer said the victim's 3 children who lived in this house had all gathered in the hallway right outside of their parents' bedroom. The officer said it appeared that the 2 teenage girls were okay, but the 8-year-old boy had lost feeling and movement from the waist down. All 3 kids have been taken to the hospital. Montano nodded and thanked the officer again for his help. Then Montano and Thompson looked at the scene on the bed again, and for some reason they both had the same thought. Did the 2 teenage girls murder their parents and maybe paralyze their little brother in the process? The idea of that upset both detectives, but they couldn't rule it out. The detectives had a theory that the motive for most murders boiled down to one of 3 things: money, sex, or revenge. And in a mansion like this, in such a wealthy neighborhood, there was definitely a chance that the kids had gone after their parents to maybe get their money. So after spending hours at the crime scene and organizing a canvass of the neighborhood, Montano and Thompson decided to really begin their investigation by talking to the Sachs children. That morning, a few hours after Andra and Brad's bodies had been discovered, their 19-year-old son, Ashton, was sitting on his couch playing a video game inside of his 1-bedroom condo in Seattle, Washington. Ashton was lanky, with straight brown hair that hung down over his forehead. It was a Sunday afternoon, and one of Ashton's favorite things to do on Sundays was to sit on his couch, smoke a little pot, and play the video game League of Legends for hours on end. And so he was doing that when his phone rang on the coffee table, and he glanced down from the TV and he saw it was his older brother, Miles, calling him. So Ashton paused his game and he answered his phone. The 2 brothers both lived in Washington, but they attended colleges on opposite sides of the state, so they didn't get to hang out very much. But they still made it a point to check in with each other fairly frequently, and they got along reasonably well, even though they were not really alike. Miles, who was 21 years old, had always been seen by his siblings as the golden boy of the family, and he definitely took after his mom when it came to business. Miles was already managing some of his mother's real estate properties in Washington, and he had dreams of starting his own company someday, just like his parents had done. Ashton was way more into computers than he was into business, so he'd gone to college in Seattle to study computer science, and he hoped he'd be able to get into a tech or gaming company when he was a bit older. When Ashton put the phone to his ear, he heard Miles's voice cracking on the other end, and he couldn't understand anything Miles was saying. Ashton asked Miles to slow down and to tell him what was going on. Then Miles, somewhat point blank, told Ashton that their parents had been found murdered, their brother was now in the hospital and couldn't feel his lower half, and their sisters were now talking to the police. Ashton just sat there in silence for a second. Then Miles told him he needed to fly home immediately and help take care of their younger siblings. Ashton had always seen Miles as the leader among the Sachs children. After all, Miles was the oldest and their parents had always trusted him, so Ashton, who was clearly in shock, said he would do whatever Miles thought was the right thing to do. Later that day, Miles and Ashton both flew from Washington to Orange County, California, and after they both arrived, they immediately went to the hospital to check on their brother, who was still in recovery, and then they reached out to the police. Several hours after they had arrived in Orange County, Miles and Ashton, the 2 oldest Sachs children, sat down in an office at the sheriff's station to talk to Detectives Montano and Thompson. Miles was significantly taller than his brother Ashton. He wore a dress shirt and slacks, and he had brown curly hair. Earlier that day, Montano and Thompson had talked to the boys' sisters, and they still considered them suspects, but police didn't have any evidence to hold them at that point. So the boys had gotten to see their sisters earlier, which made them feel a bit better than they had when they had left Washington. At the sheriff's station, Miles and Ashton looked like they were doing their best to hold everything together. But Montano and Thompson could tell, underneath their kind of tough exterior, they both seemed exhausted, and the detectives had no idea what they were going through after all they were hit with that day. So the detectives started by thanking the brothers for coming in, and then they gently asked them, where they had been when the rest of the family was at the house. Miles and Ashton explained that they had been in Washington, where they both went to college. Then Montano asked the brothers if they could think of anyone who might have had a grudge against their parents. Miles and Ashton looked at each other, and Miles nodded and Ashton nodded back. It was like one of those moments where siblings can say a lot to each other without actually saying anything. Miles took a breath and then looked at Detective Montano and said there was a long list of people who had it out for their parents. A look of surprise came across both detectives' faces. In the short time they'd been working this case, everybody the police had talked to made it sound like Andra and Brad were very well liked and admired by just about everyone. But Miles said that just wasn't the case. He told detectives that his mother's very aggressive way of doing business had led her to make a lot of money and a lot of enemies over the years. There were investors who felt like Andra had cheated them out of money, there were clients who felt like she had ripped them off, and there were tenants in some of the rental properties Andra owned who believed she was an evil landlord. Miles thought most of the people who were angry at his mom were really just jealous of her success, or that they didn't understand how business worked. But once those people believed Andra had wronged them in some way, there was just no changing their minds. Then Montano asked if Miles or Ashton could name any particular person that was one of Andra and Brad's potential enemies. And Ashton said they would actually need a couple pieces of paper to be able to list everybody. By the end of the interview, Miles and Ashton had provided police with 2 pages filled with the names of previous business associates and renters who might have wanted to harm their parents. So, detectives Montano and Thompson immediately went back to their theory that most murders are about money, sex, or revenge. Their first instinct had been that one of the Sachs kids might have wanted to get their parents' money, and so that was why they attacked them. But now, looking at all these names on these 2 pages, the detectives started to think that it was very likely that Brad and Andra might have been killed by someone who was out for revenge. In the days following Andra and Brad's murders, Montano and Thompson learned that the murder weapon had been a Ruger .22 semi-automatic rifle. So part of the investigative team focused on tracking down that weapon in the hope it would lead them to the killer. During that time, Montano and Thompson concentrated on the list of people that Miles and Ashton had provided them. And as they did this, the detectives discovered that there was even more anger towards Andra and Brad than their sons may have even realized. While searching social media, the detectives found multiple posts from people celebrating Andra and Brad's deaths. Most of the people posting were disgruntled renters who had lived in properties that Andra owned. So Montano added all those people who were making posts like that to their list of suspects and started to work through that list. But out of all the people they had looked into, from social media to the lists of names the brothers had given them, one group of people in particular stood out to the detectives. They were board members who had worked with Andra and Brad at one of the first successful companies they had started together. It turned out that years earlier, the board of directors had kicked Andra out of her own company because they said her business tactics and what they called her destructive raging were damaging the business. Andra had not left without a fight, and she had threatened to sue everybody involved with the company. And so finally, the board had just given her a payout of $9 million to walk away quietly. But when the company had faced bankruptcy, the board had started going after Andra in court to get the company's $9 million back. So Montano and Thompson saw these board members as people who wanted both money and revenge. The detectives met with individuals from the board, and they almost all said the same thing. They thought Andra was a terrible person to do business with, but they were horrified by what happened to her and her husband and her son. Those interviews also led to a list of even more past business associates who had grievances with Andra and Brad. And so Montana and Thompson felt like they really were just swimming in names of potential suspects, and they still hadn't even ruled out Brad and Andra's daughters. The investigative team was willing to methodically go through the entire suspect list if necessary, but Montano and Thompson believed if they could just track down the murder weapon, they could propel the investigation forward a lot faster. So they started to delve into the cell phone records of everybody they thought could possibly be connected to the murders. And they caught what looked like a huge break. A cell phone call had been placed from a car driving on the street at the bottom of the hill just outside of Brad and Andra's mansion around the same time the murders had taken place. But, just like the murder weapon, the car that the phone call had been made from seemed to have vanished. About a week after Andra and Brad's murders, 4 of their 5 kids, so all the siblings minus Landon, who was in the hospital, stood huddled together at the front of a church in between their parents' coffins. Over the past several days, those 4 siblings had barely left each other's sides, and they had spent most of their time with their little brother, Landon, in his hospital room, until they had finally gotten the good news that Landon was going to live. However, doctors said he would not walk again. At the funeral, Miles, the oldest sibling, spoke first about his unique relationship with his mother. He called her Andra and not Mom because he felt the connection they shared went beyond that of just mother and son. They were also friends and business partners, and Andra had always treated him as an equal. After Miles spoke, he went back over to his sisters and wrapped his arms around them. He was much, much taller than both of them, and so it almost looked, as they were standing there, like Miles was their father and not their brother. Then Ashton, the other brother, stepped forward and took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and as he read the eulogy from this piece of paper, you could see his hands shaking. Ashton spoke about how lucky he had been to have parents like Andra and Brad, but for most of the time that Ashton spoke, he spent his time talking about his little brother, Landon, and how whoever had done this had robbed an 8-year-old boy of the chance to grow up with a mom and dad, and how they had also robbed him of the use of his legs. It was just so tragic. After Ashton had finished talking, people in the church were openly sobbing as they offered condolences to all the kids. And even though those people knew the family had money, they wondered who would take care of the kids, and how they would ever move on from what had just happened to their parents. In the days following the funeral, the other Sachs siblings began to notice a change come over Miles. It was like he stopped being a normal older brother and switched into business mode like they had seen their mom do before. Miles met with authorities so that he and Ashton could obtain legal guardianship over their younger siblings. Then he moved all of the kids out of the mansion on the hill and into that one-story home Andra had bought with the intention of making Brad's life a bit easier. The other kids were angry about the move, but Miles said it was the right financial choice to make. This way, he could complete the sale of the mansion like his mom had intended, and the family would make millions of dollars. The kids were confused and upset, but they'd always looked up to Miles, and he seemed to have a clear plan, and he assured them that everything he was doing was in their best interest. So, in the span of a couple weeks, the Sachs kids had lost and buried their parents, and had moved out of their beloved house, and the younger kids had started having to answer to their own older brother, Miles, as if he was their parent. While Miles tried to get the family situated in their new home, he also reached out to his parents' lawyers to make sure he would have control of Andra's rental properties. Again, Miles said everything he was doing was just to make sure the rest of the kids would be taken care of and that they wouldn't have to worry about their financial futures now that their parents were gone. But even some of the kids' aunts and uncles thought Miles's behavior following the death of his parents was very bizarre. They understood that he did have a lot in common with Andra when it came to doing business, just being really aggressive and straightforward, but it almost seemed like he had already moved on from grieving, which just seemed impossible. Miles's actions didn't go unnoticed by police either, so Montano and Thompson returned to the idea that maybe money had been the motive for murder, and they wondered if maybe Miles had killed his parents just to get a hold of their financial assets and their companies. But Miles, and also his brother Ashton's alibis, had both checked out. People had seen them both in Washington on the morning of the murders. So Montano and Thompson just kept pursuing the 2 pieces of evidence that they thought would break the case wide open: the Ruger .22 semi-automatic rifle used in the murders, and the car that someone had placed a call from just outside of the mansion at the time of the murders. About 3 weeks into the investigation, Montano and Thompson were sitting together at the sheriff's station reviewing the steps they had taken so far. They were still pursuing every lead they had, including the seemingly countless number of enemies that Andra and Brad had made over their years of doing business. Just then, Montano's phone rang. He picked it up, and a member of the investigative team was on the other line, and the officer sounded excited. He said cell phone records had finally led them to a man who was in possession of the car that phone call outside of the Sachs house had been made from. Montano hung up, and the police got right to work securing a warrant to search the car that investigators had just tracked down. When the warrant came through, Montano and Thompson and other members of the team went to do a full search of the car. and when police popped the trunk of that car, they found a pile of clothes and also a Ruger semi-automatic rifle inside. They now knew who had murdered Andra and Brad. Based on cell phone records, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence found at the scene of the crime and in that car, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened when somebody murdered Brad and Andra Sachs in the early morning hours of February 9th, 2014. At 1:30 a.m. on February 9th, the killer drove their white Toyota Prius slowly down the road at the bottom of the hill right below Andra and Brad's mansion. The Prius didn't make much noise, but the killer didn't really need to worry about being heard or seen anyway, because the Sachs' mansion was totally secluded and it sat on an acre of land, so nobody really lived that close to them. The killer parked the Prius at the bottom of the hill and stepped outside. There was a light, cool breeze coming off the ocean, and it was a very mild 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The killer wore jeans, a t-shirt, and gloves, and they had a knit hat pulled down almost to their eyes. The killer then walked around their car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a loaded Ruger semi-automatic rifle with a sling on it. The killer slung the rifle over his shoulder, closed the trunk, and then began walking up the hill towards the mansion. The moonlight shone through the palm trees, and the killer could hear waves crashing on the beach nearby. Everything felt so calm, but the killer's heart was pounding in their chest. The killer reached the top of the hill and came to the wall that surrounded the front of the house. The killer stretched out their arms and grabbed the top of the wall and then pulled themselves up and climbed over it into the front yard. The porch was lit, but the rest of the house looked dark. The killer stayed low and ran to the front door. They opened the door and walked into the large foyer in the front of the house. The huge windows allowed enough light into the house for the killer to clearly see the staircase leading up to the third floor. But the killer didn't move. Instead, they just stood there silently for several minutes. And then the killer began to pace around the first floor, deciding what to do next. Finally, after the killer had been on the first floor for nearly 15 minutes, they took a deep breath, they unslung their rifle, and marched upstairs to the third floor. The killer walked quickly down the hallway of the third floor towards the main bedroom. They hesitated when they reached the closed bedroom door. But after taking a breath to steady themselves, the killer reached down with one hand, they opened the door, they stepped into the open doorway, raised their rifle, and began to fire. Bullets riddled Andra and Brad while they slept, and blood spattered the walls and soaked the sheets. The killer had fired almost 25 bullets into the room before they stepped back out of the doorway. But when the killer stopped shooting Andra and Brad and they turned around, they saw a little boy running the opposite way down the hall. So the killer just raised the rifle again and fired off 2 shots, and the boy fell to the ground. Then the killer walked further down the hall past the boy who was now writhing in pain on the ground and came to another closed door. They kicked the door open and fired a shot blindly into the dark room. That bullet struck the wall just above the bed where 17-year-old Lexi was hiding under the covers. Then the killer heard the little boy he had shot screaming in the hall right behind him, so the killer just slung the gun on their back again, ran down the hall, and flew down the stairs. The killer reached the first floor, their head was pounding, their ears were ringing, and they were out of breath. But they heard movement on the floors above them, so they ran out the front door and across the yard. They reached the wall, pulled themselves up, and climbed over it. Then they ran down the hill back to their car. The killer opened the trunk, took the rifle off their back, and chucked it inside. They pulled off their knit hat as well and tossed it in with the gun. Then they took off all their clothes and chucked them in the trunk, and then grabbed some fresh clothes from the trunk and put those on. Then the killer hopped into the driver's seat of the Prius, started up the engine, and hit the gas. Then, as they were driving away from the house, the killer grabbed their cell phone from the passenger seat and made a quick call. The killer's head was still pounding, and they still felt like they couldn't breathe, but they knew their night was not over yet. So the killer tried to focus. They drove across town to an apartment building and pulled the Prius into a parking garage. They parked, got out of the car, and then walked a few minutes towards a major street nearby and found a cab waiting for them. The killer climbed inside, and the cab drove them to the airport. Hours later, at about 10 a.m., the killer landed in Washington state. They caught a cab at the airport and drove home. When they got home, they made sure their neighbors physically saw them, and they also texted one of their closest friends in the area just to make a show that they were in Washington and not in California. Then the killer headed inside of their place, sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, and started playing League of Legends. 19-year-old Ashton Sachs had murdered his parents, he had shot and paralyzed his little brother Landon, and fired a gun into his sister Lexi's room that easily could have hit her. It turned out Ashton had always deeply resented the way his parents treated his older brother, Miles. Ashton felt like Miles was treated like the golden boy, and his parents treated him, Ashton, like a failure. And that resentment had festered for years until Ashton started to consider murdering his parents in cold blood. Ashton went so far as to do serious research into different types of weapons and to figure out the differences between first and second-degree murder. Then Ashton had gone out and actually bought a semi-automatic rifle. But even after he'd gotten the gun, Ashton still wasn't sure he could actually go through with killing his mom and dad. He felt like he hated them, and he blamed them for a lot of his shortcomings, but he just didn't know if he could actually pull the trigger and end their lives. But then, the day after Brad's 57th birthday, Andra had texted Ashton to tell him how disappointed she was that he hadn't even called to wish his father a happy birthday. Ashton, very sarcastically, said that he only forgot it was his dad's birthday because his dad had forgotten he had a second son a long time ago. This led to an argument between Ashton and Andra, and Ashton finally decided at the end of that argument to go through with his plan. On the day before the murders, Ashton had driven his white Prius 18 hours from Seattle to San Juan Capistrano, California. He waited patiently in town for a few more hours, and then he carried out the murders in the early morning. Ashton had arranged for a cab to meet him and take him to the airport, and for a transportation company to drive the Prius back to Seattle and to keep it for him until he was ready to pick it up. So, immediately after the murders, he called that transportation company to verify the address where he would leave the car for them. Then he had dropped the car off in that parking garage, met the cab, and flew home. And it was that phone call to the transportation company that he made right after killing his parents that led police to Ashton. Using cell phone data, they tracked down the owner of the transportation company, and they learned that he had Ashton's white Prius in his possession. Then the search of Ashton's car led police to the murder weapon. When police had initially questioned Ashton, they believed he had been in Seattle on the morning following the murder. But the discovery of the Prius undercut that alibi and made it clear that he would have had time to commit the murders and fly home by the time he had been seen in Seattle. But before police arrested Ashton, they wanted to make sure they had an airtight case that would lead to a conviction. So they dug deeper into his life. It turned out that Ashton had dropped out of college without telling any of his family, and that he had started to isolate himself from most of the people around him. Police also searched his internet history and found all the research on weapons and the different degrees of murder and what each one means, and so police believed they had more than enough evidence against him. When police arrested Ashton, it didn't take long for him to confess. But he made it clear that he had not just killed his parents because he thought they liked Miles better than him. Ashton said his parents had always made him feel like he was weak. He said dating back to the time when he was just a little kid and his baby sister had drowned in the hot tub, his parents didn't seem to care about how upset he was, or even try to get him some help to deal with the grief he was going through. And then, not long before the actual murders, Ashton had gone through this very bad breakup with his girlfriend and gotten really depressed, and he had tried to take his own life by overdosing on painkillers. And Ashton said he felt like his parents didn't really even care. While the other children had a totally different view of Andra and Brad, Ashton felt like murdering his parents was his way of getting revenge on them for all the times they'd made him feel unimportant. Ashton was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. He was given 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 100-year sentence for what the court referred to as special circumstances surrounding the use of firearms. As of 2022, Miles, the oldest sibling, was still looking after his younger siblings like he was their parent. And now at 17 years old, Landon, who was paralyzed from being shot, became one of the top 20 wheelchair tennis players in the entire United States, and he hopes one day he'll be able to compete at Wimbledon. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, that has many more stories just like this one, but a lot of them are only on YouTube. Again, that YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. Okay, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for your support. See ya.